Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome. Welcome to the Geneva Press Club. Welcome to those following online. My name is Isabelle Falconier. I'm the director of the Press Club, and I'm very glad to open this Greycells 2024 intergenerational dialogue dedicated to the role of international Geneva. And I also have the pleasure to be your moderator tonight. Thanks very much to Greycells Association for hosting its annual dialogue here in the Geneva Press Club. Just like Greycells, Geneva Press Club mission is to value and promote international Geneva. It has been a very pleasant and fruitful collaboration, and the evening Greycells has prepared for you tonight is just amazing. For the opening part of the evening, I have the pleasure to give the floor first to Greycells President, Mr. Alejandro Bonilla Garcia. Alejandro, you have the floor. Online, otherwise you won't hear us. Here you are.
Here it is. Well, good evening, everyone. Excellencies, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, all protocols being served. I am delighted to welcome you to the 6th International Dialogue of Greycells, a platform we initiated in 2018, just a few months after the passing of the former United Nations Secretary General Kofi Annan. Michael Muller, still deeply impacted by the loss, showed us the way forward that Kofi Annan would have advocated, embracing women and men of all ages and generations. In Greycells, we consider that leaving no one behind and building back better could be an option, but we prefer to bring everybody up front and building forward better, including multilateralism. This dialogue represents a unique collaboration, the fruit of the brilliant minds and hard work of more than 20 partners, including schools, universities, student associations from Geneva and abroad, as well as permanent missions, Geneva-based NGOs, NGOs from various regions, and global coalitions, all including talented students and professionals, both active and, as we call them, non-practicing retirees as the members of Greycells. For the survival of humanity, it is crucial to prioritize peace, security, and development. To effectively address these imperatives, we must reimagine and reform the multilateral system. This involves enhancing both political and technical multilateralism within the United Nations framework, with international Geneva serving as a pivotal element in this renewed structure. And this is the compelling case that our prestigious panelists will make today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alejandro. And now, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the Honorary President of Greycells and, of course, former Director General of the UN Office in Geneva, Mr. Michael Muller. Mr. Muller, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. I'm very happy to be with you here to this really useful conversation, and I hope we come up with something interesting. Most people, when they talk about multilateralism, tells us that it's in crisis and that the world is going to hell in a handbasket and that things are really bad. I'm not of that school. I'm much more of an optimist. I think that multilateralism is in transition. It's clear that the multilateralism that has served our humanity incredibly well over the last 80 years no longer functions. But it's still there, and it's still very much needed, and we certainly need to change it. We are going to have, and we are already moving towards a new kind of multilateralism, one that is more collaborative, more integrated, de-siloed, more networked, and much more preventive. And this change and this move and trend, if you want to call it, happens in a context of several trends at the same time. One is we're living a governance transition at all levels of our societies, where those sitting around the decision-making tables are very different, or will be very different than it was before. Before, we usually only had governments around that table. Today, and even more so in the future, we're going to have a whole host of other actors that are getting together to both set policy and to take decisions on how we're going to manage our planet. There's an interesting trend also that plays in, and certainly plays into what we're going to be talking about. And that is that all organizations today, whether small or big, UN, NGOs, not UN, are all being judged and will increasingly be judged by their impact. The time when you were getting money and political support and other goods for simply by existing, as has been the case for certainly the last many decades where the UN is concerned, is over. And this is part of this changing trend into this new multilateralism. And I think that this is the way it should be. Unless we can prove impact and we can prove that we are actually providing something of value to our fellow human beings, these organizations will close in short order. Of course, the Sustainable Development Goals, the roadmap, the international and global roadmap we have for how to move forward is still very much in play and still very much an inspiration for how we need to work together. The baseline here is that with this new multilateralism, using the SDGs as a backdrop and as a foundation, if we don't find ways of collaborating and working together in ways that we've never done before, we're not going to make it. It's as simple as that. All this against the backdrop of major existential threats. I don't need to go into that. You all know what is at play right now, and the speed with which we need to move in order to have half a chance of solving some of these problems. And this is, of course, one of the big frameworks around what we do. Another one which we don't speak about so much, but which will have absolutely incredible impact on our lives, is the advent of new technologies. They're coming at us at warp speed. We are all impacted these days by artificial intelligence and very worried about how we're going to ensure the ethical aspect of it, the good governance aspect of it, and the equity. But what is coming is much, much more impactful and will change our lives to a much greater extent than what we're seeing now. Artificial intelligence today is pretty much child's play compared to what is coming. Whether it's in artificial intelligence, whether it's in quantum, whether it's in human augmentation, whether it's in all sorts of neurological new technologies, it's really quite something, and we're not really prepared for it. So that's another aspect that kind of envelopes all of these activities that we need to work on. One of the nice things about all this, and one of the trends that is really positive, is the increasing involvement of youth and the increasing involvement of women in the affairs of our planet. Both of which are incredibly necessary, and without either of which we're not going to make it either. So that gives hope. Now there's nowhere else that provides, the epicenter for what we're talking about is right here in International Geneva, the operational hub of the international system. There is nowhere else that provides such a broad and powerful ecosystem, the action of which impacts every single human being on our planet every day. So it's really very timely that we hold this discussion today. And I thank Greycells for having taken the initiative and done the hard work together with its partners to make it happen. And I think it's especially important since this is structured also as an intergenerational dialogue. an indispensable way forward to ensure that our youth are enabled and encouraged to manage the affairs of our ailing planet that we are leaving in their hands. So I congratulate and thank our young partners who very much have been and are part of this effort. What comes out of our discussion today will be fed into the deliberations of the upcoming Civil Society Conference, 9-10 May in Nairobi, which in turn will feed and provide substance to the Summit for the Future to be held in New York in the fall. You know, there's a saying that Geneva is the kitchen and New York is the dining room when describing the UN structure. And I believe that that is proving to me more and more correct as we move ahead. So let's all cook up a great meal today and serve it to those who really need some much improved food for thought and food for action. I wish you all an excellent, fruitful and impactful session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Muller. Youth and students have a large place tonight, and please welcome Mrs. Sarah Gugoli. She's the president of Swiss Diplomacy Students Academy. Please, Sarah, you have the floor for an introductory word.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, esteemed guests and fellow youth. Today I stand before you as an advocate of the youth and the women, and to discuss the crucial role of these young people in shaping the future of multilateral institutions like the United Nations, particularly in the context of the International Geneva and the concept of UN 2.0. The youth have shown a great courage in advocating in the values and the work of the United Nations, called for a renewed UN that truly serves the needs of future generations. As the future leaders of tomorrow, it is our responsibility to stand up for these principles and actively participate in shaping the global agenda for a better world. However, the responsibility to drive change and innovation does not solely rest on the shoulders of the youth. While the energy and passion of the younger generations are essential in pushing for progress, creating new pathways requires a collective effort that involves individuals of all ages and backgrounds. Building bridges between different generations is key to ensuring the sustainability and effectiveness of transformative work. Intergenerational conversations provide a platform for sharing experiences, knowledge, and perspectives, thus laying down a solid foundation for collaboration and understanding. By fostering these dialogues and collaboration across all age groups, we can strengthen the bonds that connect us and create a more inclusive and holistic approach to shaping the future. This is why I think that today's dialogue represents such an important space of precisely a dialogue. The work that has been done by Greycells, by including the youth and different actors contributing to the conversation, is a representation of what should be done in many of the discussions concerning the future of the international scene. International Geneva holds a central role in the global conversation, bringing together experts, diplomats, NGOs, and international organizations from around the world. This unique concentration of knowledge and experience makes Geneva a vital hub for addressing global challenges and advancing progress on key issues such as human rights, peace, and sustainability. Youth engagement in Geneva is crucial for bringing fresh perspectives and innovative solutions to the table. Our generation must mobilize, take to the streets, and demand a more resilient and citizen-engaged UN that addresses the pressing challenges of the 21st century, like climate change, human rights, and conflict. Therefore, I urge my fellow youth to step forward, engage with diplomats, researchers, and the private sector in Geneva, and contribute to the dialogue on shaping the future of the United Nations. Let us harness our energy, passion, and creativity to drive positive change and work towards a more peaceful, equitable, and prosperous world for all. Together we can be the driving force behind this transformative UN 2.0 that reflects the values and aspirations of the global youth community. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sarah Guguli. Yo Diplomacy Students Academy has been a Greycells partner since many years. And now we have a video message by Mrs. Tatiana Valovaya, the Director General of the UN office here in Geneva. We listen to her.
Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, it is my great pleasure to address this 2024 intergenerational dialogue. And I would like to thank Greycells and its many partners for organizing this event and for bringing together different generations, young people as well as current and former international civil servants, united by their search for solutions to the challenges of our times. The focus of your discussion could not come at a more important moment. The upcoming Summit of the Future in September presents a once-in-a-generation opportunity to address the current crisis of multilateralism while preparing for the challenges of the future. The role of International Geneva in support of the summit cannot be overstated. Our diverse, dynamic, and highly knowledgeable ecosystem has a key role to play to address the existential challenges we are facing today and those on the horizon. This delicate balance between the past and the present is at the heart of sustainable development, and it requires all of us to think and act with future generations in mind. But achieving this effectively necessitates the meaningful engagement of young people. It is vital that they are fully involved in decision-making process at all levels, particularly as such decisions will shape their future and those of generations to come. This event is a powerful example of demonstrating how International Geneva is walking the talk on mainstreaming and an intergenerational lens. At the United Nations office at Geneva, we value opportunities to engage with young people in the context of our many annual events, such as the Young Activist Summit and Model United Nations, as well as through the various work organized by the SDG Lab. As we move forward in preparing for the Summit of the Future, I invite you to continue working together and use these intergenerational principles in your work. This is a paramount consideration to reinvigorate multilateralism and to ensure a sustainable future for present and future generations. I wish you further thinking and very fruitful discussions. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen,
words. So, what's planned tonight? 3 30-minute panels, each dedicated to an International Geneva feature. Those 3 features are what makes the value, the DNA of Geneva, and its assets today and tomorrow, hopefully. Each panel will focus on 2 concrete examples of those features, and at the end of each panel, a young discussant will comment it. At the end of panel 1, we'll have the presentation of the results of the Greycells survey. And at the end of the 3 panels, Greycells awards ceremony. Then, cocktail dînatoire in our other room downstairs. There are no official breaks, but you may come and go if you need to grab some water or some air. about Q&A sessions, they'll be short. So if needed, for those following us online, Greycells can put you in touch, of course, with our panelists for further exchanges. Et nous pouvons prendre des questions en français également, en ligne ou sur place. And finally, we'll be over in Thursday at 8:30. So let's start with panel number 1. Panel 1 is dedicated to the normative role of international Geneva. Our panelists are, and please join me on stage and take a seat, Mr. Ignacio Packer. Mr. Packer is the Executive Director of Co-Initiative of Change Foundation. So please, when I call your name, just join me on stage and take a seat. Yeah, first one is perfect. We have also Mr. Raymond Sanner. Mr. Sanner is professor at Basel University, co-founder of Center for Socio-Economic Development, and our young discussant is Shadeisha George Matisse. She's a master candidate at University of Geneva. So yes, thank you. Welcome. Thank you and welcome, and thank you for joining us tonight. Since the League of Nations, the multilateral work of Geneva revolves around negotiating rules and standards in several key areas, increasingly important for the multilateral governances, from rules on global health to refugees, on intellectual property to telecommunications, as well as labor rights, as we will see also on panel 3. So, Mr. Ignacio Packer, you are the Executive Director of Co-Initiatives of Change Foundation. You'll talk to us about respect for humanitarian law and human rights. So, how can respect for humanitarian law and human rights survive today? You have the floor. Yeah, it's... No, it should be on. Let me check.
That's good. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, so we're in the epicenter, so the kitchen, and there are a number of cooks in the kitchen, and they are coordinated, and we try not to spoil the broth. Geneva is home to a number of organizations that are dedicated to the respect of international law and human rights, and to provide humanitarian assistance. Now, it's also the place where we promote humanitarian principles, and one could look back in the last months and perhaps say, what are you all guys doing? No? The situation in the world is just deteriorating, so what is happening? And it is true that there are desperate humanitarian crises. There is humanitarian hypocrisy by many actors, double standards, no basic access for humanitarians, and these are incompatible with, of course, international humanitarian law. The killings of children in Gaza just 2 days ago, just in Rafah, is unspeakable suffering of civilians by the fighting. And this goes on despite all the efforts in Geneva, the international condemnation, and the call for the imperative of protecting the civilian population trapped in Rafah. But Geneva does keep on hammering to respect humanitarian law and human rights, and to promote humanitarian principles.
Last year, the Secretary General for the UN presented a new agenda for peace. What are your views in this regard, and in the context of the summit of the future?
Yeah. Shall we say a new peace deal is needed, and the new agenda for peace is very strong in terms of describing the situation, but does lack the energy, the drive, that we need to really move considerably the needle. The new Agenda for Peace, which is, as a reminder, one of the 11 documents for the common agenda for the summit for the future. It's great language, but there's one fundamental thing that is not yet sufficiently developed that we hope that for the version that we get in June we would see a little bit more. It has a lot. It's around shared responsibility, stronger national leadership, in introducing funding mechanisms for peace building, moving to more nimble and agile models, but the deeper structural, institutional, political challenges facing the UN are hardly there. I mean, we do have calls for the reform of the Security Council, calls to revitalize the General Assembly, but in terms of recommendations, there's nothing yet there that is going to be really move the needle. And one can then consider that perhaps this is just pragmatic. I would call it a low level of ambition on this. Perhaps it's just a realistic reflection of what can be achieved today, or the pragmatic response of the limitations of the UN as a peace and security actor in its own right. But we have to push for the UN to be more than a convener of the efforts of others. And this new agenda has to be bolder, with a purpose of building peace and preventive conflict in the difficult years that we have ahead of us. And I am, Mr. Kohler, also, I have chosen clearly to be in the positive and not to be looking at things in a cynical way, and to really believe that we can move the needle. And what's going on in the discussions here in Geneva are strongly an attempt to move a bit more radically this, but for the moment, it's insufficient what we're getting, what we're heading for.
You've just spoken about Gaza, so looking at the news these days, it seems that the humanitarian principles and human rights are increasingly forgotten. So Geneva is also the center of humanitarian assistance, multilateral center of humanitarian assistance. What is its role nowadays, precisely?
Well, it really has to continue consolidating its role as certainly a kind of a guardian of international law, but also the motor of a number of activities. But I also think, and this is certainly what we believe at Co-Initiatives of Change and a number of other organizations, that Geneva has to attract something different. And that thing which is different is around our skills and the qualities that individually we have. Because you talk about a kitchen with a number of cooks, they try not to spoil the broth, they're coordinated, but do they have the right skills and the right qualities, each and every one of them, from the head cook to the one just cutting the carrots? And that is where we believe that, and this is in our strategy of 2030, is to bring here to Geneva the discussion around the inner development. Okay? So we have the Sustainable Development Goals, which are absolutely extraordinary, and if we had to start again today, we would not get the beautiful language that we have in it now. It is ambitious and so on, but there is something missing there. We have a blind spot, and we hear governments and different actors saying that we are backtracking because of COVID, because of the climate, because of war and so on. But are we giving sufficient attention to the inner development that is needed for each and every one of us? The skills and the qualities that are needed to react in different ways in an environment which only moves the needle very slowly. So if the change doesn't come from each and every one of us, we're only going to be satisfied by moving a few degrees. And there is a sense of urgency. I don't know if you realize, I don't sit on a chair because I am all the time wanting to move things. And I hope everybody sits on the edge of the chair, because that's where we are. And we have to get really nervous about the situation. But the solution is in each one of us. It would be absolutely extraordinary if we could bring here to Geneva the discussion around inner development goals. Geneva is the place where we talk about inner development goals and that we push them into processes in systems here in Geneva. That's certainly what the organization I work for with other partners is working on.
So it's how you see the role of Geneva-based Human Rights Council with regards to a Security Council, which we see as paralyzed.
Yes, well, the Human Rights Council, and there are several studies that have been published from the Geneva Academy of International Humanitarian Law and Human Rights, but also the UN Center for Policy Research, around the role that the Human Rights Council could play. There are case studies that have been done. They've been looking at the dysfunctional Security Council that we have at the moment, and it's dysfunctional because it was built last century, and in the middle of last century, and geopolitics have changed, and the veto system, of course, that has been used more frequently in the last decades, is certainly of a major concern for peace and security. And the role of the Human Rights Council, well, some say it could fill in a bit more, but it probably will not fill in the void that is left by a dysfunctional Security Council. But however, here in Geneva, with the Human Rights Council, it has a role to play because it can bring more of the discussions around what are the solutions that should be looked at. Looking at the full UN architecture on peace and security is the big stumbling block that we have ahead of us. Many of those things, if we don't solve that, many of the other things will not be able to be implemented as we would hope.
Okay, thank you, Ignacio Packer. Mr. Raymond Seiner, so you're a professor at Basel University, co-founder of the Center for Socio-Economic Development. You'll talk to us about the need for new intertwined rules between WTO, climate change, and sustainable development. So why and how WTO and environmental rules need to be envisaged with new approaches? How do you see those intertwined rules? You have the floor, Mr. Seiner.
Thank you. Quite a difficult topic, I think.
Oh, yeah.
Gets me to stand up.
We need someone like you to make us understand how it can function.
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank our friends from Greycells for having come up with a very good topic to look at multilateralism, multi-sectorialism, multi-stakeholderism, and how does this whole thing comes together or not, and particularly to what extent is this important for Geneva. Now, yes, I'd like to look at the environment, which is as much a high risk as the wars, the unfortunate wars that have started in the countries we follow, from the Ukraine, Gaza, Sudan. The environment is as much a risk for us all, but it's now less in the news. But I think all of us who read what, for instance, the IPCC has published recently, we're not on a good direction. World's CO2 emissions have continued to grow. There is supposed to be a limit at plus 1.5 Celsius, and we're at 1.2. And most people think we're going to certainly reach 1.5 or maybe even go up to 2 with catastrophic consequences. A few people are left who think this only happens every 10 million years, but I think most of us are conscious about the fact that we have to do something about it. So, to what extent could the WTO contribute to us all meeting the limit, which is not more than 1.5 Celsius? There was the Ministerial Conference 13 in Abu Dhabi a few weeks ago, and there are several countries who have formed so-called Friends of the Environment, who hoped to have a resolution passed, but there was no resolution. The majority of the member countries were not in favor of it. So what can be actually done within such a multilateral organization called the WTO? Well, when you think about it, there is no trade allowed based on slavery or slave work. There's no trade supposed to happen when it comes to endangered species. There are limits that we have all agreed, but the rest is still free, so to speak. That is, countries are, of course, interested in defending their companies, getting market access, defending their own markets. And here we go, the more trade continues, the more likely people, of course, consume. And we're entitled to consume to survive. The question is just how much of consumption is really needed, but that's a different story. And as much as there is high demand, there will be high production. And a lot of that is done in ways that are clearly bad for the environment. How could it be structured differently? Well, this is something that I've been proposing, other people have been proposing, but we have to understand a few elements that I'd like to summarize briefly to go back to the topic about multilateralism, multi-stakeholderism, multi-sectorialism, which shows how difficult it is to change something at that level. Countries, let's take my country here, Switzerland. We are members of WTO, and for some areas of trade, our government, of course, is very interested to get markets to be opened to Swiss companies. On the other hand, that's offensive, called offensive interests. On the other hand, there are some sectors where our government is more defensive, where they'd like to shut down the market to foreign producers. Now, every country goes through the same process, so every country, in a way, is a national little multi-sectorial process. The different interest groups meet, sometimes are being told what the official position is all about, and the delegate going to the WTO is there to represent the interests of the country he is representing. Well, that's the same, of course, for all the other member countries. And all of them have rights. When they became member of the WTO, the accession power process meant they agreed to certain rules. But they also have rights that they can insist on. They don't have to give them up, such as producing goods in a more environmental friendly manner, or prohibiting certain goods which are detrimental to health and detrimental to the environment. So if we were to get everybody on board, we would have to really reassess the so-called notion of sovereignty. Every member country, as a sovereign country, has rights. And because each one has specific interests, they don't want to give them up if they don't get something else, which is natural, it's a give and take. So we have to introduce a different discourse, including maybe even the word contrat social is not totally wrong, where people overall start to engage in a discussion where, for the benefit of our survival, and especially of the young generation, we should give up a bit of our sovereign rights and conclude an agreement, including with other important multilateral organizations based here in Geneva. WIPO is one, ILO is another one. All these normative international organizations represent, again, their members, that's the countries, and each country has, again, specific interests they don't want to give up. We have to bring them together like a big family, a township meeting, and for the benefit of all of us, figure out a way to have, in a larger setting, in a larger context, a new give and take, which would include giving up some of the rights to produce anything, whatever, at any kind of CO2 consequences, to bring back some limitations, some modesty. And I think we still will have a great time in terms of our own lifestyles, but it doesn't make sense anymore to continue as we are producing and consuming. So I'm looking forward to, hopefully, a meeting of similar minds, and all the multilateral environmental agreements, we have 28 of them, the WIPOs, ILOs, WTO, come together with their member countries, a bit cajoled and guided and motivated by their societies, to come up with a reasonable agreement to stop the environmental warming. That's what I would like to, in a nutshell, summarize.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Salner. We can applaud him. And I now give the floor to our first young discussant, Mrs. Shadesha George Matisse. She's a master candidate at University of Geneva for questions or for a brief comment of what you've just heard.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am particularly pleased to be here, and I feel honored to represent the University of Geneva, as well as my master's program, the Master's in European and International Governance. But I am also pleased to be here as a citizen from a small island developing state called St. Vincent and the Grenadines, located in the Caribbean. And just one fun fact about my country, since we are speaking about international Geneva and multilateralism, St. Vincent and the Grenadines to date has been, or is, the smallest country ever to be elected to the United Nations Security Council, having been elected in 2019. Now, with regard to the topic at hand, the normative role of international Geneva, and particularly international humanitarian law and human rights and its survival today, as well as climate change and sustainable development, there is a lot to be said from the perspective of the youth. And I believe I speak for many youths when I say that there is a sense or a great deal of anxiety that surrounds us with regard to the direction and the way in which the world is moving forward. We don't have all of the solutions, we don't have all of the answers, but we believe that we have a part to play in coming together with the technocrats, with the practitioners, and with those who have been charged in international institutions and in positions of power to make a difference and to really incite the change that is necessary. And when we speak particularly about human rights and humanitarian law, today we are witnessing cases where there are military operations that have resulted in mass cases of citizen abuse and deaths. And the situation becomes further complicated and aggravated. And I think we could all agree, especially when there are powerful states that support, and they do this financially, support the life of these operations. And for us as young people, this is a very vexing problem because there are so many other new wars that are happening internationally that require greater focus. As I mentioned earlier, I am a citizen of a small island developing state, and as a citizen of a small island developing state, I think of the war on climate change, for example, and how this in itself poses a great deal of threat and challenge to not only the lives of those people who live in the Caribbean, but those people whose lives and livelihoods depend on agriculture, for example, and for trade. And in speaking to trade and making it more sustainable and making it more climate friendly, I always think of a bottom-up approach that is needed when tackling these issues, for example. And because I have a particular affinity for human security, I think of humans as being the referent object in international politics and international security, as the thing that is being threatened, the thing that is ultimately being threatened. And if we think of what is happening in the world in terms of a human context, then I think it would make the job easier because it touches the vital core of all of our lives. It touches human elements. And so for us to have a sense of humanity so that we could all live in a better world, I think right now, this is what is particularly required in this international realm, where we're trying to foster international cooperation and international peace. And yesterday, for example, April 24th, we commemorated the International Day of Multilateralism and Diplomacy for Peace. And I think it is very fitting that this dialogue is taking place here today because, for example, it is important because where the SDGs are concerned, for example, we think of SDG 16 with peace, justice, and strong institutions. And the SDGs we know were fashioned by the UN, and as the Director General mentioned, it's a roadmap. And this is an organization that you also mentioned that is going to be judged along with other organizations for its impact. And that is one of the things that young people feel most pressed about. What exactly is being done to ensure that our futures are sustainable and that we have a future in this world? And so when I think of SDG 16 in particular, SDG 16 has been the cornerstones of all of the other SDGs, all of the 17 other SDGs. We think of the targets. There can be no poverty without SDG 16. There cannot be education for all without SDG 16. And so in trying to achieve SDG 16 and its targets, I believe that it is absolutely necessary for the United Nations itself to see itself as an institution, as an organization that is also a part of this quest to fostering and achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, in the sense that the UN cannot see itself as being the arbiter of what exactly is taking place. It has to become a part, it has to hold itself accountable to all of these goals and these targets that are set. And this, again, I believe is particularly important for young people because the question is always being asked, what is the UN doing? And we feel as though the UN, yes, is paralyzed, yes, it is crippled, but the question really is, does the UN really have a future? Thank you.
Thank you. A very brief comment from our two panelists to answer to what Daisha George-Mattis just said, and then we'll move forward. So would you like to comment, our young discussant, maybe question?
Well, perhaps a comment about values of conscious and love. Don't often talk about love, do we? But it should be more in our language. Conscious and love, they are integral parts of building peaceful and just societies. We refer to SDG 16 without entering into that. And actually, I make it short, but I talked about the Inner Development Goals. they're developed in the same way as the SDGs. This and initiatives of change, co-initiatives of change, we run training sessions and we have a forum this summer where you practice this. It's not only the framework, it's how do you practice it? And this is the blind spot that we have in a lot of the work that we do. It's difficult to explain in just a few seconds, but you're welcome to have a look at what we are offering. And by 2030, this has to be an integral part of Geneva. That's certainly what we are hoping to move the needle to.
Thank you. Mr. Sanner, would you like to have a brief comment on our young discussant?
For
words?
Sure. 16 is divided by 2 parts. The first part is about conflict, and the second part is about how our organizations, how our institutions are supposed to be organized. Now, when it comes to my topic here that I was discussing about environment, to change the course, which was fully going towards a bit catastrophic futures, we have to change, normatively speaking, rules. It's not enough to have just a talk about behavior. So the question is, for instance, when it comes to 2 things. One is SDGs, you mentioned, that makes sense. But we have had an agreement called the Paris Agreement, where our countries committed to reduce overall CO2 emissions. The question is, who will do it? Who? In each country of ours, who will be assigned to produce less CO2? That's a negotiation. That's not just an attitude or wishful thinking. Then we have, on the other hand, also generally the SDGs, and in general also how we have SDG 13. It's about the environment, climate change. How does this make sense? We have on one hand SDG 13, on the other hand the Paris Agreement. On the other hand, in order to improve, we have to attribute or get to a social contract where people keep to it and not just talk about it. That's my reaction.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much to our first panelist. Thank you. Okay. We'll move forward to the presentation of the results of Greycells survey. Please, Young Partners team, join me on stage. Young Partners team is Mr. Rotsopong Hap, representing University of Geneva. You can come on stage all together. Mrs. Maria Teresa Faili, she is the Vice President of Geneva International Model United Nations. Mrs. Clara Praski, she's Junior Diplomats Initiative co-chair. She's a co-chair of Junior Diplomats Initiative. And Mrs. Victoria Orisberger, she's from Swiss Diplomacy Students Academy. And also Dilara Unulu from Swiss Diplomacy Students Academy as well. She's not on stage, but she contributed to the survey. Mia Kirsch from the Junior Diplomats Initiative, who will come have with us later with the conclusion panel. I'll give you the microphone so that if you want to use the desk here. You are. Okay, you have the floor.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you so much, and welcome everyone. We will now presenting the results of the survey that was conducted in advance of the dialogue. So, first of all, some general information on the respondents. In general, more information can be found in the detailed analysis. I will just give a very quick overview. In total, we had 146 responses, covering a diverse range of perspectives and experiences in terms of age, nationality, academic and professional background. What can be also said is the largest group in terms of nationalities, not surprisingly, are Swiss respondents. The largest groups in terms of age is between 32 to 65. And the largest group in terms of profession are former and current UN staff. Now, without further ado, let's dive into the questions. We won't cover all the questions, so I highly recommend you to also read our analysis in its entirety if you are further interested. So the first question I want to touch on is the question whether multilateral activities of International Geneva contribute to international peace and security and or the Summit of the Future. And in general, it can be said that the comments made highlight the interconnectedness between Geneva and New York, and also the interconnectedness between the different pillars, the interconnectedness between human rights and peace and sustainable development. In general, 35% believe that there's a limited impact, 12% that there's some partial impact, and 23% believe that it really depends on the activities. At the same time, a limited number of comments also highlight that the fundamental or the immediate decisions are made in New York. And therefore, we also find a lot of comments that call for a stronger inclusion and attention of Geneva in New York. So basically, the main takeaway can be that you cannot separate Geneva from New York, and yet the framing and also the attention needs to be stronger. The next question I want to briefly talk about is the question why negotiations held in international Geneva are rarely mentioned in the media. And here we can see that a lot of respondents, around half of the respondents, believe that the media coverage on international Geneva is limited because of its technical nature of the negotiations. 16% believe that the limited media coverage is also due to the fact that the negotiations held in New York are more important. However, there were also a lot of other aspects covered by the participants in the comments. Geneva is perceived as less political and thus less interested in, for the public, and considered less attractive for the media coverage. And besides the technical nature, also the confidential nature is highlighted, and also the fact that when it comes to international media is not as present in Geneva as it is in New York. And therefore, also some respondents see some room for improvement the way that UN-related developments in Geneva are disseminated to the media, to the press. When it comes to the role of NGOs, it can be said that a large majority thinks that the Geneva-based NGOs have an impact on multilateral negotiations. Only 10% believe that the NGOs are not influential. However, the respondents also underline that it's highly context-specific to what extent the NGOs have some influence on the negotiations. However, there's also some space for improvement. Respondents mentioned that NGOs should be stronger involved, and also the space for the NGOs should be more inclusive, allowing smaller NGOs and NGOs from the Global South to be also actively involved in the decision-making. Super. Now turning to the Summit of the Future. What is very... here it is. What is very interesting is we had a question about the knowledge on the Summit for the Future. And overall, the knowledge highly varies among the respondents. And this variety can also be traced back to the highly diverse background of the respondents, which also makes clear that there seems to be a disconnect between experts involved in the Summit for the Future, also reading up on the Summit on the Future, and the general knowledge of the public. And several respondents highlighted that there is room for improvement when it comes to the media coverage. Also, when it comes to the expectations on the results on the Summit of the Future, it can be said that overall, interestingly, the number of positive responses is identical to the number of neutral responses, and also a similar picture can be seen when it comes specifically to the Summit of the Future and International Geneva. What can be stated, though, is that only a small number of respondents have negative expectations on the impact of the Summit, on its effectiveness in general, but also on the role of International Geneva specifically. The rather skeptical but rather limited comments highlight that the Summit won't bring any meaningful change and that the current draft lacks content. The positive comments include more the symbolic nature of the Summit, that the Summit sends a message for multilateralism, and there's also some hope for some small reforms. Now, having said that, and having given an overview of the general comments, let's dive into the specific sections, which will be presented by my fellow peers.
So I'm going to look at the questions that were intended for diplomats, government representatives, the Office of President of the General Assembly, co-facilitator of the negotiation of the Pact for the Future, international organization, and NGO staff. As you can see on the graph, half of the respondents have mainly worked in Geneva rather than in New York. So we will mainly have their opinions. To me, the question from the point of view of UN member states' external policy, when compared to New York, do you think that the multilateral agenda addressed in Geneva is? Its answer was the most interesting, so we are going to have a look at it. The predominant responses underline that the two agendas are of equal importance, that they are complementary or interconnected, and that their importance varies according to circumstances and/or the global context. On the other hand, the less frequent responses indicate that the Geneva agenda is sometimes more and sometimes less important than the New York agenda, that they are distinct or separate, and that they are more or less important depending on the country's level of development. I think that this answer accurately reflects reality, because in theory, the two agendas are supposed to be the same level and designed to complement each other. The predominance of this response therefore suggests that this vision is being properly implemented. Although I still believe that the two agendas should be complementary, linked, and equal of importance, taking into account each country, so that the agenda is the most beneficial for all parties. As one comment put it so well, there is and there must be complementarity between the Geneva and New York agenda, because the reality is not fragmented into watertight pieces. And finally, we see that to other participants of the survey, it was also important to take member states into account, which have a major influence on the application of the agendas, depending on their recognition of the cluster between Geneva and New York, their foreign policy, their government, and so on.
So we had also another question. It was, how would you assess communications, coordination, and interaction between Geneva and New York-based permanent missions, particularly regarding the preparation of the UN Summit of the Future? So for the answers, the majority replied that they didn't know, or that they didn't have an answer to this question. Then a smaller majority replied that it depended on the situation and its context, or that it was unsatisfactory. Looking at the comments, we can see that the behavior of the ambassadors play a major role in relations between these two cities. There is a lack of overall vision, and coordination between the two cities can be very important in resolving conflicts. Both cities have their strengths and they should take advantage of each other. Relations also depend on the level of contact between the two permanent missions, and the more links there are, the more coordination there is, but the smaller the missions are, the less communication there is. I also have another question. So, in your view, which of the following features of multilateral diplomacy are more prominent in Geneva than in New York? There are two majorities in this question. The first one is that the issues of negotiating treaties, conventions, and regulations are the most important. The second one, think that interactions with NGOs, think tanks, new universities, and the private sector are the most important. Then there's a fairly even split between those who think it's interactions with the Secretariat of international organizations and those who think it's setting priorities and understanding multilateral issues on the basis of independent research and data. Thirdly, developing efforts and the will to reach consensus. Relations with the host country are thought to be addressed more in Geneva. We can see here that Geneva is seen as a key city for all the processes around treaties. According to those people, Geneva has a certain importance in communicating with the various actors of the international scene. Geneva has a welcoming climate when it comes to the various actors of the international scene. There is a certain respect for independent research, which makes Geneva more confident than New York. Geneva hosts important headquarters, which gives it greater weight in the field of human rights. There is a general agreement on Geneva having a more respectful atmosphere because there is support for multilateral diplomacy.
So, good evening, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Sopong, and I am from Cambodia, representing the University of Geneva. So, I will continue on demonstrating journalists' perception toward the international Geneva. So, I have selected 3 questions among our 7 questions to demonstrate on what journalists feels about international Geneva. So the first question is how journalists assess the attention given by media to news on international Geneva in terms of quantity and quality of information provided. So the answer is that the majority feels that the attention given is either barely sufficient or just adequate. However, a significant portion believe that it is largely insufficient, which indicate a need for improvement in both quantity and quality of the coverage. And on to the next question, how journalists consider their role in the general public's understanding of the issues and or shaping public opinion on international Geneva. So most journalists view their role in covering international Geneva as important, with a smaller portion considering it essential. However, we can also see a notable number that are unsure of the importance of their role, and a few respondents even believe that their role is not important at all, without providing us any specific reasons. Thereby seeing the different opinions toward this question, I think most journalists acknowledge the importance of their role in raising public awareness of the international Geneva, while some still do not realize their role or even underestimate their potential in spreading and influencing their audience pertaining to international Geneva, mainly on its integral role in multilateralism. And the last question, how journalists see the evolution of the role of international Geneva in the UN system for the next decade. So responses reflect varying perceptions of the future role of international Geneva within the UN system. A minority foresees an increase in its role. A similar number believe its role will remain unchanged. Another minority anticipates a diminishment in its role. And lastly, a significant portion either did not provide a response or were unsure of the future. So this diversity of opinions suggests uncertainty or differing views among journalists regarding the trajectory of international Geneva's role within the UN system over the next decade. So journalists who are able to receive and go through more news than general public should be more aware of the UN system in which their views toward the future of international Geneva are important, especially to provide personal input on what can be done for the betterment of the system. And lastly, my personal take as an international student is that journalists and media companies should increase their involvement in topics concerning international Geneva and also the UN system. Because not only does it increase the public awareness, but it can also help the future generation, especially future leaders, to understand the importance of multilateralism and different forms of conflict resolution within the international level. And also, therefore, to solve any future disputes by diplomacy, rather than forcing the small conflicts into the armed conflict, which cause thousands or millions of casualties. Thank you very much.
So first of all, good afternoon to all the participants and all the organizers. I'm Maria Teresa, Vice President of the GMOON Student Association, and I'm going to briefly sum up the last part of our survey, which covers all the questions answered by students or younger people under 32 years old. Starting from the most significant question, we asked to the students to what degree they felt that young people have an impact on decision-making and in shaping the multilateral systems. As you can see, the respondents could answer between not much, a little bit, as much as others, a lot, or don't know. From the answers, we can see that a large majority of the students and young people feel to not have much or only a little bit impact on the decision-making processes. Also, let's also notice the good part of the respondents that answered don't know or no replied at all. I want to start from this question because it really shows, and it clearly shows, the lack of participation perceived by the young generations in the multilateral systems. To deepen this younger generation's belief and perception, we decided to ask another question to deepen the issue. This time we asked, in their opinion, how the other generations perceive young people's contribution to shaping the multilateral system. Again, there were several answers. Other generations don't value young people's contribution. They only value it a little bit, to a certain extent, or they don't value it at all, or again, don't know or no reply. The answers were even worse, and if I can also add, kind of sad. We can see that more than half of the respondents feel that other generations don't value younger generations, while the other half value it only to a certain or a limited extent. I felt that these two questions were really important to understand, first of all, how the younger generations are feeling in the multilateral system, As we could see, younger generations don't feel to have a significant impact in the field, and even if they have an impact, a limited one, they perceive the other generations don't value their contribution at all, or only a little bit. So what can be done to make sure that younger generations and students can have much wider impact in this contest? We asked them, So we asked them specifically through another question, what in their opinion are the actions that should be taken by the UN system specifically, or the International Geneva more in general, to involve young people in diplomatic and decision-making processes. The most voted option, as you can see, was to promote youth representation in permanent missions or in diplomatic circles. The other three most voted options were establishing youth advisory panels for international organizations, training programs on diplomacy for young individuals, and finally encouraging youth participation in international conferences and negotiations. All these responses, as you can see, underline therefore a significant lack of young participation, not in one or two or three items, but in several contexts of the Geneva International. This last answer clearly informs that the younger generations would love to be considered more, but unfortunately they are not. Thank you so much for listening to our analysis survey, and we hope that it can be useful for the future. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much Thank you to the Young Partners team for this very interesting presentation of Greycells survey. You can find the complete results of the survey and also a synthesis of the commentaries on Greycells website. Please have a look to all these very interesting details. They're really worth it. Let's move to our second panel. Panel number 2 is dedicated to multidisciplinarity as a Geneva routine. Our three panelists are, and please join me on stage, Mrs. Nina Birkeland. She's a former Norwegian Refugees Council Senior Advisor on Disaster Displacement and Climate Change. Second panelist is Mr. Paul Ladd. Mr. Ladd is the Director of the UN Research Institute for Social Development till the end of the month, and also designated Honorary President of Greycells. And our second panel young discussant is Mrs. Lara Siebenhaar. She represents the Swiss Diplomacy Students Academy. So, multidisciplinarity, because the scope of its agenda is very wide, and thanks to the concentrations, it's in such a small town of so many experts in all fields, Geneva is well equipped to break the thematic silos and to develop multidisciplinary approaches, such as those using economics and sociology, international trade and environmental law, human rights and new technologies, etc., etc. So, Mr. Paul Ladd, what is briefly the UN Research Institute for Social Development? And why is it, of course, relevant for multidisciplinary work done in Geneva and also worldwide? You have the floor.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you very much for inviting me to this very important event. It's great also to see lots of old friends and colleagues from the last 9 years that I've spent in Geneva. The UN Research Institute for Social Development is an autonomous research institute based in Geneva for the last 6 decades. Autonomous in the sense that we don't have member states in our governance system. We have a board of independent academic advisors drawn from all different parts of the world. And we're a very small secretariat, essentially, that coordinates research with a network, again, drawn equally from all the world's regions, balanced regionally, but also balanced by gender. A network typically of about 400 people a year, a small secretariat of about 20. Our DNA is essentially questioning. Our DNA is progressive. Our DNA asks the difficult questions around power, around inequalities, around politics, around distribution. And that makes UNRIS quite a special place to work, because we get a little bit more freedom to ask the tougher questions. We do support for governments directly. We also support our UN colleagues in Geneva, the agencies. We also work with, of course, the universities, the think tanks, the other entities here that are interested in peace, human rights, sustainability, and inclusion. And in brief, I would just say that multidisciplinarity is a strength, in the same way that this dialogue has been constructed to bring together the insights of people of different ages and backgrounds. Multidisciplinarity does the same. In UNRIST, we have economists, political scientists, sociologists, anthropologists, environmental scientists, geographers, and we believe that through those different insights from those different backgrounds, from all the parts of the world whose partners that we work with, that brings strength. And I think it's the same approach that's been taken in the dialogue tonight.
You spent 10 years in New York and 9 years, as you've just said, in Geneva as a UN senior staff member. What did you learn regarding the differences and complementarities of the UN work in these two locations?
Okay, so it looks like I'll be leaving the UN soon, so I can be perhaps a little bit franker about it. So Michael described Geneva as the kitchen and New York as the dining room.
Yeah.
And we oft hear the distinction that New York is where the politics happen, and here's where the technical agencies sit. And there's a large deal of truth in that, but not entirely. I mean, there's big technical and policy capacity in UNFPA, in UNICEF, in UNDP, in the universities and think tanks that also exist in New York. I came to Geneva in 2015 and I felt it immediately, the distance. I'd worked in the SG's office in New York and I felt that there was a gap. And indeed, many of the projects that we've tried to do with, for example, the Geneva Science Policy Interface, a very important but small organization based here, has been trying to bridge that gap, to make sure that the technical knowledge from Geneva makes its way also into political processes. And I want to finish on this question with an example of how I think that worked best, or when it worked best. I also have this theory that a bit like when you work in an office, your organization takes on or is guided by, inspired, held back, motivated by that office. And I think it's sort of the same for New York and Geneva too. Geneva is such a beautiful, sort of accepting, considerate place to work. It's also perhaps a little bit slower than New York. New York is very fast, it's very reactive, perhaps it's certainly too reactive sometimes. Geneva is very methodical, quite careful, and perhaps a little bit slower. Now, I'm not attributing good or bad to slow or fast, but there is a cultural difference between working in Geneva and working in New York, and I think sometimes that drives the gap a little bit. The collaboration doesn't happen by accident. It needs to be deliberately designed. And of course, it's not just Geneva, New York, it's also Rome. It's also increasingly Bonn, it's Vienna, it's Nairobi. All of these have technical agencies that can contribute to this agenda. And the example that I wanted to give briefly of where I thought it worked very, very well was in the preparation for the SDGs, because there was a deliberative process over many years, which I think people found to get quite boring towards the end, because they thought that they talked about all this already, that incentivized collaboration between different parts of the UN and the member states to talk about sustainable development. One of my colleagues in UNDP at the time called it the biggest ever training for diplomats on sustainable development that ever happened. And each agency contributed. They saw what they could contribute to the SDGs. Governments were talking frankly about what their priorities were. And you ended up with an agenda, of course, that's quite sizable, but it's ambitious, and everybody participated, and the language is ambitious. But it had to be done deliberatively. You had to mobilize resources, you had to oil the wheels, you had to construct a process in which the skills and contributions of the different entities could be woven together into something then that was worthy of all that effort. And also, in doing so, built trust in a way that the SDGs landed much more squarely and firmly than the MDGs had 15 years before. So that's the example I wanted to give. It's very possible to weave together the expertise from all the capitals where we work, but you have to do it on purpose, deliberatively.
Yeah, so you seem to have faith in a new eco-social contract, but and in also reforming our economic system for sustainability. But is this feasible? Is Geneva well equipped to put those ideas from theoretical model to practical policies?
Yeah, in Unrest, we work with the concept of ecological social contracts. And the argument, very, very briefly, I know we're running out of time, is that even social contracts from all parts of the world, but especially post-World War II social contracts that were created in Europe and North America after the Second World War, have broken down. Mistrust in government, mistrust in formal institutions, a stagnation of wages, very high inequalities, ecological destruction, polarized politics, fracture across different societies. And people feel that they don't really belong. And our argument is that societies will have to move to more inclusive and more ecologically minded social contracts over time. And that is happening already, particularly with young campaigners in sectors, in countries, on issues, campaigning for more inclusion and campaigning for processes which are more ecologically minded. So we think it's happening already. We call them ecological social contracts. We think it will happen over time. But what I think is that the crux of our unsustainability is how we incentivize and govern our economic system, which includes trade, as Raymond was talking about earlier, but fundamentally rests on our obsession with growth and our commitment to overconsumption. An individualistic, competitive consumption that's been amplified, particularly by the corporate sector in the last 40 years. And it's unnecessary, and we can't afford it. We're already using 3 times as much resources as we have on the planet. And once you've seen that it's our economic system which is at the root cause of our unsustainability, it's difficult to unsee. It's a bit like the Matrix. And there's sort of a collection of agencies in Geneva who are contributing actively on a daily basis to a debate on beyond GDP. UNRWA most certainly is, but you also have UNCTAD, you have OHCHR working on human rights-based economies, you have the Special Rapporteur Olivier de Schutter pulling a big report together on post-growth and degrowth. So there's a lot of activity here. You have the Social and Solidarity Economy Task Force that UNRWA started in 2013, which is about building small businesses and encouraging entrepreneurs who want to incorporate social and environmental objectives into their business model. There's a lot happening here. It reached New York. 10 years after the formation of that task force, there was a GA resolution in New York where member states committed to growing their sectors on social and solidarity economy. So yes, I think it's practical. More than that, I think it's necessary. And lastly, I think International Geneva has a very important role in making it happen.
Thank you, Mr. Ladd, for those very encouraging and hopeful words. I'll give now the floor to Mrs. Nina Birkeland. As a former Norwegian Refugees Council senior advisor, you'll talk to us about climate change and human mobility. So your area of work and research concerns the impact of climate change on human mobility. Could you explain this concept of human mobility and why it matters, and also why it matters at the multilateral level?
Yeah, no, thank you, and thank you everyone for still being awake and paying attention. When we talk about human mobility, that's a very cryptic term, and I think many is like, what is that? And why I wanted to put this in here is also very much that when I started to work on displacement and climate change, when I started, we didn't call it climate, we called it the environment. But simplified, in the late 80s, in the 90s, people started to realize you can't just talk about refugees from conflict and violence, you also need to talk about, one, how does the environmental degradation, climate change, impact those fleeing, but also how can that be a source of displacement. I will not go through all the different discussions, but one of the things which I think is interesting seen from the Geneva perspective is that 10, 15 years ago, not many people talked about climate change and displacement. humanitarians who say, yes, it might be important, but we need to save lives. We can't talk about climate and environment. And a little bit on the other side, that displacement thing, why is that important? Back in 2011, something very important happened in the climate change negotiations. It did not happen in Geneva. It happened in Cancun when that year's conference of the parties under the UNFCCC, the climate change negotiations, took place. Some smart people thought we need to get displacement, migration into the climate change negotiations. This is a big issue. It's a lot of power, it's a lot of resources, and this is where a lot of the issues will lay in the future. No one wants to mix migration, displacement, and climate change. It's too political, it's too sensitive. So they called it human mobility. It's slipped into the text with a parenthesis saying this means displacement, migration, and planned relocation. So having a term that is neutral and is not stopped and redlined because some people think this is wrong meant it was suddenly a space to work on it. A lot of people from us on the NGO side, researchers, UN people and states thought, no, UN, Geneva, will pick this issue up. We looked at the UN organizations working on displacement and migration, but it didn't really happen. So in the end of 2011, you had Switzerland and Norway coming together at a big meeting of UNHCR and saying, well, we need to deal with this issue. UN, they didn't say it like that, but UN is not ready to take it yet. Let states come together in collaboration with the UN organization, in collaboration with NGOs, academics, etc. And something called the Nansen Initiative was created. So this process has been based in Geneva since the very beginning. And I think no one questioned at that time that shouldn't be based in Geneva. You have the UN, but you also have a space where you can actually work together, less political than, for example, if you had put this secretariat in New York. I also think it's linked to some countries taking a lead. So Switzerland was very clear, this is an issue, and they also put money on the table, not just saying it's important. And I think this is also what we see is that decisions, but also needs to come with resources and interest. At this time, this was an issue where people who work technical could work together, and you were allowed to do a lot of things. And we really got a strong collaboration between many, many different actors who normally maybe not work too much together. So kind of coming back to this, human mobility was a way to label it. You got it into the system, and then you start to fill it.
Yeah. How should we protect the rights of the populations displaced by climate change? Is the refugee laws applicable?
Yeah, and when we went to the climate change negotiations, people said, yes, climate refugees, put them into the refugee convention, case solved. Those of us who had worked on refugee rights for many years before we started on climate change, like, no, don't even touch the refugee convention. Any attempt to negotiate that will come up with a weaker document and will take decades. And also, yes, there's a lot of space in the refugee law and policy to protect people who are displaced in the context of climate change, but that is really about persecution. So what many said is that let's be very pragmatic while we're also principled. So try to insert this issue into a lot of ongoing processes and make use of what's already there and not spend time to make a new convention that everyone will agree to, because that's too slow. We would still be negotiating. With this process that was a bit outside the UN, but in close collaboration with the UN, you were able to come up within 3 years a declaration that more than 100 states signed on to. This is an issue we need to do something with, and you need to look at it at different ways in different regions based on what is the space, both concretely, but also what's the political and power game in different regions.
So you would say Geneva, as we hear tonight to talk about international Geneva, is the appropriate location to address these flows, new flows of new climate displacement population?
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think what is important is that the two UN organizations that work with people on the move, IOM and UNHCR, have their headquarters here in Geneva. But you also have, as some people talked about in the study that was presented, you also have quite a few NGOs who are here, who have the expertise. You have states, and you had the willingness to actually talk about it. So in this process, you had a state-led process set up. In the beginning, it was Norway and Switzerland leading it. And as it moved on, it was then Germany and Bangladesh co-chairing. It was then France and Fiji. Currently, it's Kenya being the chair of this process, together with the EU. But it's always been kind of out of the Geneva environment, and it also, of course, linking not only to the people on the move, but also you have UNDRR, the United Nations Disaster Risk Reduction Office there. You have OHCHR, so you have a lot of other the UN organizations where you need to tap into to have some progress for people on this.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Nina Birkeland. I give now the floor to our young discussant from this second panel, Mrs. Lara Siebenhaar from the Swiss Diplomacy Students Academy.
Thank you so much. So we've talked about them, or us, a lot today, the youth, and how we can take them into account. And it was quite shocking to me to see the results of your survey saying that almost all the youth doesn't feel themselves heard. They're not being taken into consideration. And I think that's something that needs to be changed, is already being changed. I mean, there are a lot of programs taking into account the youth, of course, but this needs to be continued and also in Geneva, in the UN 2.0, this needs to be an important part, representation of the youth. But in order for the youth to be part of the solution, there also needs to be education. Youth need to be educated about the big problems in our world: climate change, wars, violation of international law, and so on. So that's also one important role that multilateralisms and our states have to take on. We have to educate our youth, and for that being done, we also have to be on the same platforms that they are. So I think multilateralism and international Geneva should also move on TikTok, YouTube, and all those platforms, because that's where the youth are. That's where they are actually educating themselves. And what is very alarming also in relation to that is how there's a lot of misinformation on these platforms, and I think that's another important role and problem multilateralism has to address is regulating those platforms, developing rules and agreeing on that. We're not really on top of that yet, so I think that's very important in the future, is to regulate those platforms and also be aware of that the youth is actually informing themselves on these platforms. So yeah, there are a lot of problems, as we have heard tonight, and really it will be the youth that will also bear the costs and that will need to find the solutions for these problems. And one way is, of course, to represent, to make them feel represented in our institutions, but also to leave behind a functional, representative, multilateral structure. And that's why we're here today and why the Summit for the Future is taking place. So really, I think the youth is asking you to ensure that, so that we as the future leaders have a platform where we can negotiate and we have a functional structure that allows us to negotiate and solve the problems that the current and former generations leave behind.
Okay. Thank you. Mr. Ladd, a short comment of what you've just heard from our young discussant.
Yeah, I find it very easy to agree with the argument that younger people should have a voice and an influence on the decisions being taken now that will affect the planet that they inherit, especially from the mess that was created by their parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents. They may go on to create their own messes, but we don't know that yet. But I certainly believe in that right. We are custodians of this planet and the Earth. We are not the owners, and we're not just utilizing it for our own consumption and growth at the current time. I think education is incredibly important. I also think that there's a great potential in using technology so that perhaps delegations, which may include young people, whether in governments or in multilateral conferences or in other processes, can draw on the weight of their peers, their young peers, to actually influence the debate. I mean, the example I would use is that when we crafted the SDGs, we put together this survey called My World, which was the largest survey that had ever taken place in the world. Got 9.6 million people engaged. A third of the people were under the age of 20. Distributed across all countries, you could disaggregate by gender, and you could actually pick out the issues that young people cared about, whether they were young men, young women, boys or girls. And the reason that SDG 16 made it in the end is because all around the world, young people wanted to see honest and responsive governments. And that was the only reason it stayed in, because member states who believed in governance could go to the UN and say, 43% of people around the world have voted for this. So I actually think connecting technology to young people, to formal delegations and multilateral processes is an incredibly powerful thing that hasn't been used enough in bringing young people's voices into how to shape the future world.
Thank you. Mrs. Birkeland, a short reaction to our young discussant words.
Yeah, no, two quick comments.
Yes,
first
please.
of all, I think we know, if you look to the draft for the declaration, there is mention of displacement, but it's all under peace and security. There's not one mention under climate change. So, yes, we need to put it there. But this is also where I think youth have a very vital role to play, because in a formal task force on displacement under the climate change negotiations, there are two places for civil society. One is held by Yongo, which is the youth constituency. So I think, again, how do we here in Geneva also work with the different youth constituencies that are within the UN system in other locations? So again, going back to where we started this afternoon, on the kitchen, the dinner, but none of this will happen despite the best chefs unless you have the ingredients. And these ingredients will very often be brought by youth and other groups that are not formally represented in the UN system. So again, when we use this way, make sure that we have good ingredients and we bring them from everywhere. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you to our three panelists. We'll move forward without waiting to our panel 3. We'll take a few questions after our 3 panels altogether. So let's move to panel 3. Panel 3 is a topic. Geneva knows a lot about multi-stakeholders mechanism. And so our 3 last panelists are, and please join me on stage, Mr. Kari Tapiola. Mr. Tapiola is a former Deputy Director General of the International Labour Organization, plus also the author of a book entitled The Driving Force, Birth and Evolution of Tripartism. Thank you for being with us today, Mr. Tapiola. We have also with us today Mr. José Luis Fernandez, who is an AI expert, also a PhD at the Spanish Artificial Intelligence Research Institute, also a senior lecturer at the Centre Universitaire d'Informatique of University of Geneva, and finally head of the SDG, Sustainable Development Goals Accelerator. And our panel 3 young discussant is Mrs. Natasha Pambou, and we'll have a special intervention of Mrs. Luis Rodrigo Morales, but maybe you'll join on my, maybe you can join us just after, Mr. Morales, maybe you'll join us just after, and I give you my place for the logic of the intervention is better. So our 3 panelists, so Kari Tapiola, José Luis Fernandez, and our young discussant, Mrs. Natasha Pambou. Mrs. Pambou is the president of Geneva International Model United Nations. And as we'll have a special intervention just after our 3 panelists. So exchanges and inclusion of non-state players has been a feature of the Geneva multilateral diplomacy since the League of Nations, the most elaborated, institutionalized and efficient form of multi-stakeholderism is of course the International Labour Organization. But interaction with private sector, NGOs, and the academia is very fluid in the Geneva ecosystem in all topics of its agenda. So, Mr. Cary Tapiola, as the former Deputy Director General of the International Labour Organization, what about ILO tripartism, which is one of your specialty? So you have the floor and the microphone is open. You can just grab it and you have the floor.
Okay, this seems to work, I suppose. I mean, if we talk about multi-stakeholder participation, so very often the ILO is seen as some kind of an example. On the other hand, the ILO is an exception. And I'd say it's a bit of a historical exception because it was founded in 1919. And it was quite clear that in the earlier discussions already on labor throughout, you had to have a participation of trade unions or organized labor. But I'd also like to note that at the time, the dividing line between, say, trade unions and labor parties did not really clearly exist. So, in a way, the fact that the ILO took a parliamentarian system and full participation of what we today call social partners, it's also due to the time and due to the agenda. One of the issues on which we could talk at length is that the employers' side or the private sector side has never been organized in the same way as unions, as the workers have. But that is also due to the different nature. Workers don't compete with one another by definition. The private sector competes. So you have a different starting point. But I think we should recall that most of the organizations, actually all of the UN family, have active relations with the civil society and with NGOs and with the private sector. There are multiple ways in which the International Telecommunications Union interacts, or the International Maritime Organization, or the Food and Agriculture Organization, and others. I think we could very clearly make the argument that without civil society participation in different ways, so this multilateral system would not work. It simply would not work. And the more we look at ways in which to work on the ground through technical cooperation and through partnerships and so on, the more we need the civil society, different elements of the civil society. ILO is an exception because in the ILO, employers and workers are part of the decision-making process. But they are part of the decision-making process in labor issues in every country anyway. Labor regulations can be implemented by either law or by agreements between employers and workers. And the more and more diversified the economy becomes, the more and more will be done through private agreements. And all these need benchmarks, so the ILO helps in creating those benchmarks. But on the other hand, the ILO itself has the same large amount of interaction with NGOs and civil society organizations as all the others. So it's really, I'd say the more we work on the ground, the more we need the civil society and its different actors.
And what are your views on the role of international Geneva in reaching agreements?
Excuse me?
What are your views on the role of international Geneva in reaching those kind of agreements?
International Geneva has actually inherited much of the multilateral activity that started with the League of Nations. And I think we should really understand that although politically the League of Nations may have been a failure or was doomed in the historical situation, all the specialized agencies, their activities have their roots in what the League of Nations started developing. Geneva has always been a good ground for that. It's peaceful compared with many other places. It's pleasant to live. For proper technical work, which calls for some time and patience, Geneva is much better than New York. New York, as far as I can see, they can keep their Security Council. Problem with the Security Council is that it was negotiated by allies with the kind of whose thinking at the time was that we are the good guys and we need to make this world work. Unfortunately, now all the bad guys are on the Security Council, and but as far as I'm concerned, New York can have its role, and Geneva is much, much more productive.
And what are your views on the draft pact of the future that is being negotiated as a result of the summit?
Well, I'm not very impressed, if I'd really say it honestly, because I'm missing a leading thought. I'm missing something on which one could really start working. Not a soundbite, but something concrete. I'll give you one example. In the social summit, UN Social Summit in Copenhagen, 1995, there were 2 lines in a 100-page document on international labor standards and what should be done with international labor standards at a time when there was a real debate on trade and labor standards and globalization. Not more than 2 lines. In the ILO, we built on those 2 lines a whole declaration and a whole program of technical cooperation. I'm looking for those two sentences and also missing one thing: priorities. I remember that about 25 years ago, when Juan Somerville was a candidate for Director General of the ILO, he criticized the ILO's program, budget and program, which had at the time 39 major programs and priorities. And he said that an organization that has 39 priorities has no priorities. So he started working. He came with the notion of decent work, where he had 4 strategic priorities: employment, rights, social protection, social dialogue. By the time he left, I suppose that the ILO actually had more than 39 priorities, but that's the normal development. I was looking yesterday at the report, good report, thorough report, that Mrs. Colonna, the former French Prime Minister, has made with recommendations on UNRWA, the refugee agency for Palestinians. You have 50 recommendations. Now, if I would be the head of UNRWA, I would scratch my head and say, well, where do I start from? We tend to, in these documents, which we are very good at producing, we tend to overload them with recommendation after recommendation after recommendation. There's something that we may have inherited from the old Soviet Union, because there often was a question, why are the speeches of Brezhnev so long? The answer was, if something is left out, that will immediately be seen as a political signal. Now, when we live in this kind of mode that we have to say everything about everything, we end up by saying nothing.
Thank you, Mr. Tapiola. I will now give the floor and this desk to special intervention of Mr. Luis Morales. Mr. Morales is the Director of Policy, Industrial Relations and ILO Coordination at the International Organization of Employers. So please, Mr. Morales, you have the floor and this microphone. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, and it's a great pleasure to join you here and of course listen and the views of Mr. Tapiola as a former director of the ILO, where we are as employers one of the arms of this organization. I come from the International Organization of Employers. For those who don't know this organization, it represents the voice of business. So we gather about 150 business federations that conform a network of over 50 million business. And we are organized, we are very well organized, and we bring one voice. So there's cohesion, Mr. Tapiola, to the voice and the messages that we bring to the multilateral system. And certainly this is clearly evidenced at the ILO, where we come and represent employers. But it is not that clear as it comes to the rest of the multilateral system. And this is one of the biggest issues we see and biggest mistakes we see when we try to advance the SDGs, to advance social justice across the UN system. We have to bear in mind that the role of the private sector is extremely relevant, but we are often seen just as donors, as the ones that put money in, rather than being seen as actors, as relevant actors that bring and deliver action. Just take a look at employment. The private sector generates 9 out of 10 works around the world. So what are we going to do with SDGs? Certainly SDG 8 is clear, decent work. Okay, we have to talk to the private sector if we want to talk about decent work. But what about eradication of poverty? How are we going to achieve that without partnering with the private sector? So there's a need for a stronger involvement with the private sector, not only at the level with the ILO, but across the UN system. This is one of the main aspects of multilateralism that brings importance to us, right? So to see how we can contribute and how we can collaborate, and more than sponsors, real actors delivering actions. There's, of course, policies of unemployment and social issues that are negotiated at the level of the ILO. be a social dialogue, as Mr. Tapiola mentioned, but advancing social justice goes well beyond. And that means taking action at national level and engagement. And this is why we are pushing and fostering this strengthened relationship across the UN system, and talking and partnering also with regional coordinators who are actually in charge of implementing and working together with governments. There's important issues about, of course, on new pressing issues, and I believe our colleague is going to be talking about that, AI, digitalization. There's a lot of investment around that, and this is an issue not only for governments. There's an issue for implementation of those investments from government. Certainly is needed. We have to partner, but we have to focalize. We have to listen on where these investments are needed. It's not just pushing the agenda without effective implementation. And this is where the private sector plays a very, very important role. And this is absolutely aligned with UN 2.0, absolutely. No, it is about innovation. It's about data, digital, foresight and behavioral science skills, preparedness for the future. How are we going to integrate these voices of the young people that we were listening at if we don't identify where skills are needed? How we are going to integrate these people into the world of work if we don't listen to the needs of employers, the private sector that's going to be creating those jobs and contributing to a just transition. I'll leave this message there for the exchange with my colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Morales. Thank you. Now, I turn to our second panelist, Mr. José Luis Fernández. Mr. Fernández is an AI expert, senior lecturer at the Centre Universitaire d'Informatique à Genève, and head of the SDG Accelerator. Let's talk about the need for multi-stakeholder negotiations in artificial intelligence. So, do you think that private firms, governments, and researchers can collaborate in this regard?
Thank you. Good evening, and thanks a lot for inviting me to be here. It's a pleasure. So the answer is yes, and as we can see from the other panelists, we need to collaborate, and we have to collaborate. So there is a need of collaborating between private firm, government, and researcher. Especially AI company and researcher, they play a key role because they bring the knowledge about what is AI and what are the risks that need to be regulated. So they play a key role in the implementation of efficient and effective regulation. So researchers also play a key role in identification of the risk and identification of what is regulated, what needs to be regulated, and also in support the implementation of the regulation to company, providing tools, providing methods for them to better deal with the regulation. So I'm coming from the academia, and I wanted to highlight some research where we identify potential risk on the use of AI. So the first one, during the COVID-19, we demonstrate that social media could be used for monitoring the acceptance of policies like wearing masks in public places or social distances. So basically, we took millions of images from social media, and we demonstrate that we could see whether people were wearing masks or dealing with social distance in public places. So that is very important for the evaluation of policies, to understand if people are following them, if they are adopting them, but on the same way it's creating a risk of misuse of the technology that we are developing. So we play a key role on identifying this rule and understanding what technology can be useful and not. So I have been working for the last 6 years also in the use of social media for disaster response, especially in providing information about damage just after disaster happened, like earthquake or floods. And one of the things we do is we extract from millions of images of photos that information that is relevant for emergency responder, and we geolocate them. So we are pointing out vulnerable people, and at the same time we are giving the geolocation of the social media information that go against the privacy of the most of social media of removing the geolocation. So while AI can be used for many interesting social impact, we need to take into account that the technology that we develop can be misused. And that is part of the regulation, to be aware about how that needs to be regulated. And I wanted to mention a very recent study that was conducted by a collaboration between Apple and MIT University, where they identify the gender bias and stereotypes in large language model. That means in product services like ChatGPT. So it's very important to identify that there is a risk of gender bias there, but they also provide benchmark to be able to evaluate the technology, to be able, if that technology are producing information that is biased in some way. So very important that AI should be not here perpetuating gender inequality, and that needs to be regulated. So as researchers, at the way we create new AI system or we create new application of AI, we are contributing also on identify what needs to be regulated.
So these are the kind of multi-stakeholders mechanism that would be appropriate?
Yes, so I'm coming from Citizen Cyber Lab. It's a partnership between the University of Geneva, CERN, and UNITA, when we look at new form of public participation in research and innovation. So we really believe on the role of openness, open science. When we are regulating AI, the main goal of the regulation is to protect fundamental rights of the citizens. So if we are protecting fundamental rights of the citizen, we should involve citizens in the decision that we are taking. They are the main beneficiary of what we are regulating. So when we talk about citizens, we should be inclusive, and we need to find the multi-stakeholder mechanism that ensure inclusivity and transparency, having into account woman, man, young and senior citizen. And here I'm going to connect with the previous panel, especially with the intervention of Paul and Lara, because I really believe that there is a room for new ways of multi-stakeholder mechanism which are more inclusive and which connect better with citizens and society. And we have example of research on new way of participation. We have the future for the Conference for the Future of Europe, that was one of the largest deliberation process in history. We have the technology and we have the connectivity to allow to do things together and to be able to deliberate together. So I think that the multi-stakeholder mechanism should go beyond consultation. Giving voice is good, but participating in the co-creation process is even better. So the dialogue, the communication should be bidirectional, and we should be taking decision together. So in Geneva, we have many multi-stakeholder mechanisms that have been implemented. I'm going to mention just few of them that I considered relevant. We have the Geneva Trialogue, that is a conference coming in the next month, that bring together different actors to shape the future of education of the SDGs. We have the Geneva Science and Diplomacy Anticipator that put together different communities to anticipate science and technology advances and advancement, which has a positive impact in our society. And we have associations like Open Geneva, who have been together different sectors in Geneva addressing challenges, creating roundtable of discussion, and innovating in a way between multi-stakeholders in the form of hackathons of open innovation. So I wanted to give a final message here, that we see that AI systems are evolving at a speed we didn't anticipate. So if you ask me 5 years ago if ChatGPT would be implemented, probably I would have said no, maybe in 20 years. So even our prediction about how technology is going to evolve, they are becoming shorter than expected. So the evolution of the AI is bringing challenges and need of regulation, but it's also bringing opportunities to address societal challenges. So today, more than ever, it's key to do applied research in which we center the research in this challenge from society. So, and I think Geneva is a perfect place because of the connection with international Geneva and the creation of challenges together with them. So they could be a perfect accelerator of solution addressing SDGs.
Thank you, Mr. Fernandez, for this very interesting expertise on AI. Now I give the floor to our young discussant of this third and last panel, Mrs. Natasha Pambu from Jimun. You have the floor.
Thank you. Okay, it works. Thank you very much to the organizers tonight, and thank you to Greycells for having us. I am very honored to be standing in front of all of you and to be sitting next to the very prestigious co-guest speakers we have tonight. So I'm Natasha. I am a master's student in global health, and as mentioned, I am also the president of Jimun. We're an association that aims to build bridges between student and international organizations in Geneva while promoting the United Nations principles. So this gives us, young people and students, the opportunity to meet and interact with multi-stakeholders in different spheres. So being in Geneva gives many opportunities to young people to experience closeness with agencies, organizations, civil society, and other multilateral organs that we would not have the chance to come any close to if it was not for living in Geneva and in Switzerland in general. So I think here I speak on behalf of all students and all young people if I say that it is really a privilege to live in Geneva. For young people here who come from different countries, I invite you to think about your home country and your peers, your young peers back home, and think about all the opportunities you have here and try to think about if they would have the same opportunity. Personally, the answer for me is no, and I think even New York could never. Thanks to Jimun's special status as an NGO registered at ECOSOC at the United Nations, we have been able to have links with the UN, and also for the last 2 years we have actually been organizing bid conferences with the ILO, which makes the panel today particularly relevant for me, especially because this year's conference we organized had a very interesting MUN committee about it was an ILO committee, which was about AI and job protection, so it is even more relevant for me to be part in this panel. So this brings me to a few questions that I'd like to reflect on when thinking about ILO, AI, and how the evolution of multilateral system will be. What should be their role moving forward? Well, to me the answer is quite simple. The role of AI, the role of multilateral discussions, should be central, and it can't be, honestly, any other way. For example, think about AI. Whether we want it or not, it is taking place in almost every aspect of our lives. Younger generations are not going to know anything else but a world with AI. But what does it imply? To me, it implies that it has to be supervised and framed. The debate that we had during that MUN conference raised many of the views that young people have, and they were both complementary but also contradictory. Is AI a threat or a helpful future? I like to think that it's both, and the outcome will depend on how well multi-stakeholders were supervised and implemented. Like it was mentioned just now, some limits and challenges of the AI are present and they need to be addressed in order to have a good evolution. So ILO could be one of the perfect examples on how to do so. How do you protect future jobs from being threatened by AI? How do you ensure that we will still have an importance and a relevance? Well, only by taking part in multi-stakeholders conversation, we can make sure to find a middle ground. Take the ILO. As mentioned by Mr. Tapiola, it consists of governments, employers, employees, all being in the same room and finding a middle ground to have the best income, and that works. Isn't it amazing? Here, I think I don't speak only for young people, but for everyone if I say that this seems to be the best way to keep moving forward. So, to answer another question, or really more to reflect about them, will this still be relevant in the next decade, or should it be addressed today? Well, I really believe that now, more than ever, is the time, and more than after, especially. We are in an era of change, and tackling those questions in 10, 20 years will probably be too late. The time for multi-stakeholders to have conversation is now. Probably this topic would evolve and still have some relevance in a few years, but if we don't address it now, later will be overtaken. So we young people are really living this change at full speed. It is here while we are studying, it is here while we are working, while we find our first job, so we grow with it. We are willing to participate and take part in multilateral conversation. Jimoon is here tonight. Jimoon will be there at the Geneva Health Forum. We'll be here at the Geneva Trialogue. Trust us, we are really willing to be here. And to add a bit of a positive mindset into all of this, I will add that we are not only ready, but we are also helpful into what it will take.
Thank you, Natasha. Mr. Tapiola, Mr. Morales, Mr. Tapiola, I saw you taking notes. Would you add a brief comment to what you've just heard from Natasha?
Well, I mean, I'd like to make two observations. One of them is this, what I would call a dialogue gap. I think we have at this moment a growing gap between those who can take decisions on the economy, on new technology, and so on, and those who are affected by it. And we need to find the way to get back to dialogue. And this has been the problem ever since, I mean, whichever technology it is, ever since the Luddites started or wanted to break down textile machines in the early Industrial Revolution times. So you have a question of how do you use it, how do you best use it, and then you come to the question of dialogue. And this is then where you need, those who are directly involved, employers, business workers, civil society, different ways. Another thing that I'd like to mention in this connection is the question of the private sector in general. 5 years ago, I was working on a history of the ILO's workers group. And you cannot do that without looking at the history of the employers group also. And the employers as organizations did not quite exist at the time. The notion of dialogue or cooperation was not really there. But you had different models. You had conflict models where issues were solved by conflict and where they were solved by negotiations. In one of the histories of the IOE, the International Organization of Employers, its longtime president, Mr. Oxlade, characterized the problem for the employers in the beginning of the ILO's history, early 20s, by saying that for the employers, ILO was an unsolicited gift, maybe even a Trojan horse. What could it be used for? But then they found out that yes, but working together with the unions, you could actually temper the government's desire to over-regulate things. In a way, the logic of starting to negotiate came through the experience that employers were involved in the process. And there were different stages in history. For the employers at the time, communism was a real threat, private sector employers. So the question was how to cooperate, how to find another way of dealing with this. There has been a big change which generally has not been noted, not in my view enough, on the whole attitude towards the private sector and the employers in the whole, I'd say, credo of the ILO. It starts somewhere after the end of the Cold War, when the employers were asking quite reasonably, well, what's in this for us? I mean, you can see the workers' interest, but also having a look at the employers' interest. That is when different enterprise programs and outreach started developing. And in a way there was, I don't want to use the word social contract because I have some reservations on that, but there was a kind of contract, understanding, that on one hand you recognized the role of the private sector and the role of enterprises and private enterprises in employment and economic growth and so on. But the other side of this agreement was supposed to be that the employer's side would also recognize the workers' right to bargain collectively, to organize, and the right to find issues through negotiations. And my worry is that this agreement is not being very well followed through. The whole notion of sustainable enterprises, which the ILO developed around 2005, 2006, it was based on the idea that you have the employers' rights, the enterprise rights, and the workers' rights.
Okay,
I think there's a problem there at this moment.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Tapiola. Mr. Fernandez, would you add a very short comment to what are you discussing?
Yes, so very short and relate with dialogue and also the role of the model of the United Nations. Some months ago, we were organizing at the UN Data Zone, a satellite event here in Geneva. And in that event, I have the opportunity to collaborate and to meet one person coming from the UNFCCC. And this person was using AI to facilitate negotiation within the institution. What I found it fascinating. So they were solving challenges of aggregating data, of processing data. Always supervised by humans, but with the help using AI for enhance the activities they were doing. I found some limitation in the sense that we didn't have one of the questions he was presenting, and one student said, but how do you prove that the negotiation is better after using this technique? We don't have a sandbox where we can test technologies. And I really believe that organizations like the Model of United Nations could play a key role evaluating new technologies for improving negotiation, or new technology to do negotiation with more dialogue, more participative. So I really believe that there is an opportunity there for connecting with researchers and to use the Model of United Nations for empowering decision-making about how the UN 2.0 could be.
Thank you very much, Mr. Fernandez, Mr. Tapiola, and Natasha. Thank you for this very interesting third panel. Okay. And I turn to the very true timekeeper of the evening. Manuela, do we have time for some questions, or do we move forward to the conclusions panel? Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, here and online, we arrive to our conclusions panel. Our conclusions panelists are in place. Yes, join me on stage. Mrs. Aguiveres, she's the director of the UNDP Geneva, the UN Global Development Network. Mrs. Olga Hidalgo-Weber, she's an historian. She's a professor at the University of Geneva. Also secrétaire générale du Forum Suisse de Politique Internationale, and the author of a book about 100 years of multilateralism in Geneva. And we have two other people. Daniel Warner, he's a former deputy to the director at the Geneva Graduate Institute, and a journalist, Mr. Stéphane Bussard. Stéphane Bussard is a senior journalist for Swiss newspaper Le Temps, in charge of international Geneva topics. And finally, our young discussant, Mrs. Mia Kirsch, from the Junior Diplomats Initiative. Okay, I think you'll stand. It's okay, thank you. So my questions to all of you, dear conclusions panelists. What are your main takeaway from this dialogue, and what are the main messages to be conveyed to the negotiators of the UN Summit in New York this fall? So, Mr. Daniel Warner, as a former deputy to the director of Geneva Graduate Institute, you have been analyzing the International Geneva from the academic perspective since more than 30 years. So what are your main issues, and what would be your conclusions to this evening dialogue?
Thank you very much. Excuse me. I'd like to thank the organizers and especially thank everyone in the room. It's always dangerous to speak before receptions. I want to come back to Michael Muller's original thing, and I want to talk about what I consider the elephant in this room that has not been talked about. Now, some of you may think my accent is from Carouge, but actually I'm a New Yorker. So I want to, Michael, come back to what has not been talked about. And Mr. Tapiola, I'll come back. The notion of the relation between New York and Geneva. Because Michael began with a wonderful image. There is a kitchen, 3-star Guide Michelin. They're making wonderful food, and it then gets served in the dining room. And my point, Michael, is what happens if the waiters are on strike, the room hasn't been cleaned, and the plates and silverware are filthy, okay? So therefore, my argument is that your image and Mr. Tapiola's separation of New York and Geneva, to me, is wrong. We are living in a situation where everyone knows that New York is paralyzed. And that paralysis, according to certain people, that's New York. It has nothing to do with Geneva. But if I read Stéphane Bussard and Philippe Mota, I see that in Geneva, even in CERN, there are problems involving what is happening in New York, and the paralysis is spreading. So my argument is quite simple and very short. I think the paralysis could be metastasizing. And my argument is, what is international Geneva in general going to do about its image? The results that you had were excellent. Because if New York is paralyzed, and every day on the front page, humanitarian laws being violated, human rights are being violated, do people really want to hear about a technical thing taking place at a specialized agency? And how can you sell all of the positive cooperative things going on in Geneva if New York is paralyzed? The international organizations in Geneva are having problems, and that's what the journalists want to write about. So my suggestion is very simple. If there is a paralysis in New York, and that paralysis is spreading to Geneva, what we need is not a perception change. We need a UN oncologist to deal with the problem from Geneva's perspective. How do we deal with the paralysis in New York? Because it's there. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I turn to Mrs. Aguiveres as the director of the UN Global Development Network. You bring us the perspective of a practitioner in the field, as well as connecting to policy discussions guiding global action. So how do you see the role of Geneva connecting to the realities on the ground? And what are your own conclusions after what you heard of this dialogue tonight?
Thank you very much. And I will also link back to Michael. So Michael, you're very popular with your opening speech, and that's a compliment because sometimes people glance over it. But you did talk about something very important that you also picked up on, is that, you know, we are, as international organizations, as the international community now, we are really judged on impact and not on presence, existence, or mandates, but what do we achieve? And I think this is also part of the reason that the UN is questioned. And you also mentioned that basically the only way forward is collaboration. So if we look at kind of the systems that are in place, whether it's Geneva or New York, I think, you know, it all goes back to what are those incentives for collaboration. And in certain places it's there, in certain places actually it's the counter that's there. You mentioned paralysis of New York, you know, why is that paralysis? It's not because the PRs in New York cannot agree with each other. It's because they're all representing their national interests. And those national interests link back to something that very important that Paul was talking about, is about social contracts. So when you actually start analyzing why is this paralysis, why the UN doesn't work, and I want to come back to this notion, it's really because what's really broken is governance and the related social contracts. Governance at the national level, governance at the global level, and governance sometimes at the local, between the local and national level in these countries. So I think if we want to address this problem, we really need to dig down to the root causes, because otherwise we are trying to address it at a place where it's not fixable. There is no fix to some of these paralysis problems. Some of it there is. I don't want to generalize. Then I want to go back to this notion of the UN. I heard, and I somehow I have a radar for this, when people say the UN. What does the UN do? The UN doesn't work. The UN is broken. We need to reinvent the UN. What is the UN? First of all, the UN is 193 member states. So it's all the countries, right? Second of all, when people say the UN, many times they just simply refer to something visible that really doesn't work, the Security Council, or, you know, agreements on certain geopolitical issues or disagreements on them. And I don't think there's a general understanding what actually works in the UN. When we're talking about the arms of humanitarian response, development, peace, nobody really breaks it down and says, actually, there's a lot of good things that are happening in the UN, and why don't we build on that? Of course, I'm biased. I'm coming from the development system. I work for UNDP, so my mantra is development. But I really believe that we have to invest in development, because development brings the ability to build back those social contracts, to strengthen governance, to have the demand from the citizens, from young people, from everybody, to their governments to act differently, to bring in some value-based discussions. We're talking about growth, the private sector. I mean, until we're not addressing these issues, the incentives in place at the domestic level that drive some of these discussions is not helping the cause of that. So lastly, in terms of what is the UN and why we could be better at collaboration and convening. When people talk about neutrality and the UN doesn't have an agenda, I think the main thing there to me is that the UN is actually aiming for global public goods. You can talk about neutrality, you can talk about the convening role, but at the end of the day, it's the only mechanism or parts of the UN that is producing that is really to produce those global public goods that's not produced by markets, that's not produced by policymakers, cannot be for various reasons. So that's kind of the added value of this mechanism and the underlying funds and programs and mechanisms and for and so forth. And I think in this, the role of the private sector that you raised is extremely important. Because if the private sector is driving towards growth, then policymakers can talk about degrowth, but you know, the most of the economies are not picking that up unless we're changing actual incentives for the private sector. The second point that I also would like to make is that I haven't heard, like I heard many of you talk about New York and Geneva. And maybe this won't be a popular statement, but when I came to Geneva after basically 20 years in field-facing positions, one of the first things that Achim Benman asked me from the Graduate Institute, so, you know, you're new, so what was your perception of international Geneva before you came here? And I kind of drew a blank because I didn't want to tell him I've never heard of it in these terms, because the notion of international Geneva is extremely important, what it does and what it represents. But it's not a branding exercise. I think very few people out there in the field would actually recognize it as a thing, as international Geneva. So I think to me what really matters here is what role is international Geneva playing? And I'm saying again, I haven't heard anybody talk about anything else but New York and Geneva. And there are, you know, 193 member states out there. So to me, the most important thing is not this bilateral relationship, but it's triangulation. We must connect with field realities. We must connect with the realities of developing countries especially, but also other countries. I mean, climate change is everywhere. It's not just developing countries. And what role can Geneva play in that? And I give you an example of a very kind of mundane or no-brainer thing. The Human Rights Council and the UPRs, those of you who know what the UPRs are, these are universal periodic reviews that are looking at kind of the human rights situation in the countries. And when I first came and I spoke to member states representatives who are sitting on the Human Rights Council discussing these issues, kind of the feedback from them I got was that they actually don't have any idea what happens with the UPR after they review it in Geneva. And I think, you know, there has to be an understanding that it's, for example, on this particular case, it's a very useful tool to affect change in countries, because the resolutions that are accepted are actionable. We can dispute the ones that are not accepted, but we need to focus on the policy level and normative input that can bring transformation in developing countries. And if you're not making this connection, and the policymakers and those who are reviewing it do not understand the importance down the line for action and implementation, and also as an iterative process to bring back what works, what doesn't work, I think that's where we can actually make much more of a difference from Geneva's perspective and make those connections. And I think many of you in the room have those connections. Many in several fora in Geneva don't necessarily do that, but this is definitely something we can strengthen. And sorry, I speak longer than I planned, but just one little thing on youth and this involvement and in terms of collaboration. I actually really thought the survey brought out the fact that what we are looking for is moving away from tokenism. It's not about having youth in the room. It's not even about having half of the panel as young people. And there was a suggestion there, for example, on advisory committees standing from youth. There are some countries that have youth shadow mayors. It's a fantastic idea. And I think, you know, we need to find ways, because if you don't create some kind of structures around it, which of course very easily can turn into bureaucracies, then it's just a voice that's not translating into really something to follow up on. At the same time, you also don't want to have a scripted youth participation, which is essentially just another set of NGOs or civil society's voice. So I really, really liked a lot of your contributions, and I would love to follow up and see what we can do so that we can actually bring in a non-tokenized participation of youth, what we have a control over, which is like our Geneva presence. I'm not, you know, my dreams are bigger, but I think to be practical, we can actually do a lot on that in Geneva. Thank you.
Thank you for those big dreams, Mrs. Aguiveres. And Mrs. Olga Hidalgo-Weber is an historian, as a teaching and researching at the University of Genève, and a member of the Forum Suisse de Politique Internationale. You look at the long-term trends. So which are the main issues you can point to us tonight?
Okay, thank you. To respond first to the young generation, I would like to start on a positive note by giving weight to the work undertaken here by civil society. People often have the impression that civil society just remains a lobby, but I really would like to stress, on the contrary, that civil society has played a very important role in the history of multilateralism. By the end of the 20th century, in various European countries, as well as in the United States, you have many thinkers, industrialists, social reformers, educators, trade unionists, that were not only thinking about how to improve the world, but also how to make it safer and peaceful. And so peace movement and what I called liberal internationalist movements were very powerful. They met, they traveled, they took part, as today, in international congresses, and they published many pamphlets. And it was, I think, because of their growing influence that precisely some governments, in particular the French, the British, and the Americans, asked these experts to propose and to develop plans to create international peace organization. So what I really would like to emphasize here is that in the end, government were endorsing thinking that came out of civil society, even though, of course, political consideration will come into play in order to shape organizations that suit the government geopolitical preference. This reflection applied to the League of Nations, and even more so, I think, to the creation of the International Labour Organization. It was above all the strengths of the trade unionists, of socialists, of, again, internationalist network that pushed for the organization's creation. Lastly, I would like also to highlight here the weight and influence of feminist network on the creation of the League and on the ILO, because by grouping together at the international level, women were able to achieve some of their agenda through provisions that they included in the constitution of both organizations, such as the possibility for them to become a civil servant or delegates. So I believe that 1919 was really a key moment showing the influence of civil society on the beginning of the process of multilateralism. I would like to underline maybe a second issue concerning which something very important. It's the resilience of the multilateral system. What do I mean when I speak about the resilience of multilateralism? It means understanding that since the 19th century and the first cycle of commercial globalization with the development of transport and communication networks, governments have rapidly realized the value of getting together and of building institutions to which they delegate the establishment of rules and standards in order to facilitate the organization of the world. This is what you all know as functional multilateralism, because governments really have a clear interest in reaching agreement on these issues. And the establishment of the League in the interwar period was far from a failure in this respect. As Mr. Tapiola said, it led to a whole series of activity in the field of health, of refugee protection, of child protection, of migration, economic recovery, worker protection, and of course, humanitarian law. And all these challenges, which were being, I think, successfully tackled by the League's Commission between the wars, as you know, continued within the special agency in Geneva after 1945. the Second World War led, it's true, to an Anglo-Saxon domination of the new architecture of the UN system, but I think that the new UN agency continued their predecessor work. And I believe we must be optimistic in a way, and because we can credit those organizations, which I think three major successes that I would like briefly to mention. Firstly, I believe the agency in Geneva have promoted the creation of law governing international relations. Each of the organization has produced numerous conventions in its own field, which now form a normative legal basis that has civilized international practices, that has protected vulnerable categories of people and codified the organization of the world in many sectors. Secondly, the work of international organizations and NGOs has made the world less dangerous and has succeeded in humanizing the side effect of wars. And finally, international organizations have succeeded in improving people's living conditions by, I believe, fostering a whole range of collaboration on the ground. And thanks to this expertise of their staff, which is very important and that we must, I think, preserve here in Geneva. And let me finish very briefly by underlining also, and we spoke about this here today, underlining the role of Geneva as a center of international expertise. I believe that Geneva, in particular, has two major selling points that must be maintained and expanded. First of all, Switzerland has positioned itself as a neutral player and an advocate of internationalism since the 19th century. La Genève internationale, as we call it here, it's a constructive dynamic. As international expertise is based here, when new subjects emerge on the international scene, we speak today about artificial intelligence, it is here that new forums or new incubators for reflection are created, and that in turn, I think, benefit the entire hub. And secondly, even if major political issues are discussed in New York, I believe it's fair to say that Geneva is also a diplomatic city. And I mean this in two different senses. Firstly, by dealing with humanitarian, economic, social, and health issues, Geneva also contributes to building peace. And in this sense, its work is also, I think, eminently political. Secondly, for almost 80 years now, Geneva has hosted a whole series of high-level meetings, secret sometimes, official talks, to negotiate issues of peace, disarmament, and security. And this has enabled the stakeholders to benefit, I think, from valuable expertise, political know-how, and of course, the Swiss Bons Office. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mrs. Hidalgo-Weber. And now I turn not to the elephant in the room, but to the journalist of the panels, Stéphane Bussard from Geneva-based Swiss newspaper, Le Temps. You offer us the perspective of the press.
Yes, thank you. Good evening. I will start by being provocative. The artist Ben was saying about Switzerland at the Universal Exhibition in Spain that Switzerland doesn't exist. International Geneva doesn't exist outside of Geneva, because when we were in New York, abroad, nobody talks about International Geneva. We don't know what it means. But for me, we should be more self-confident. We should be more, because it is a reality. And when we're talking about New York, Geneva, Geneva being the kitchen or the engine room or whatever we call it. I find it quite depreciative, and I think that this whole conversation about New York being political, Geneva technical, I don't agree with that, because if you listen to an interactive dialogue at the Human Rights Council, is that not political? It's highly political. If you go to ITU to talk about the new internet protocol, is that political? Of course it's political. If you elect a new Secretary General at WIPO, is that political? Of course it is. So we should be more confident about what's going on here. It's major, and I think as Ms. Verres was saying, this connection between the field and what's going on here is absolutely major, and that's a real edge for International Geneva. What is also a very strong edge for International Geneva is, we talked about it, is civil society. Civil society plays a major role in multilateralism, and in Geneva in particular, whether it's at the Human Rights Council or in other international organizations. And the Place des Nations, I think, is very evocative in this sense. We see every week a lot of people from all across the world protesting for their rights, for their interest and things like that, and that's very telling. To show the importance of International Geneva, the pandemic was very, very telling, because WHO became suddenly the center of the world. And what's very interesting is, because of the proximity of all organizations here in Geneva, the health responsible officials were able to create an organism called ACTA, for example, because of this proximity of all organizations. I think something like that would have been much more difficult in New York, for example. And we should take advantage of this very ecosystem that is very dense and very rich. On the other hand, there are risks, obviously, because this ecosystem is made of a lot of NGOs, international organizations, private sector, whatever. But we can't be complacent. There's a lot of competition on the world stage. A lot of other countries, other cities want to attract a lot of organizations. And if a big chunk of this ecosystem goes away, I'm thinking, for example, randomly about WTO, for example, because now we wonder if multilateral trade is still alive or not. See, if an organization like this would go away, it would have a big impact on the ecosystem, because that's the strength of the ecosystem, but it's also the weakness of the ecosystem. As far as the other risks are concerned, I would say that we live in a digital era, and I think International Geneva has not upped its game to the level where it should be. And I think we have a lot of work to do here to be more in phase with digital era. And I think there are progress being made, but it's not enough. And in that sense, there was an intervention with a young discussion saying that we need to include more the youth and things like that, maybe communicate with TikTok. That's one element, but I think we should use the digital era to promote International Geneva. And as far as International Geneva is concerned, there's also, because that's a concern of myself and of all my colleagues, the coverage, the journalistic coverage of International Geneva. That's a big struggle. It has been a big struggle, and it remains a big struggle to sell what's going on in Geneva, to sell that to newsrooms. And you were talking about the UPR. I think it's a fantastic instrument, and I think you're right. It brings up all the human rights issues to the surface, and that's important. But to sell this to a newsroom is very complicated, because it's very subtle and it's not spectacular, but it makes sense. And I agree with you. As far as media coverage is concerned, even newspapers are not, or media outlets are not sufficiently aware of what's going on here, and I have to struggle in my own media outlet, and it's pretty frightening to see that even huge media outlets in the German part of Switzerland have deserted Geneva because they're no longer interested in multilateralism. That's pretty shocking. And but that said, in that sense, since I see Michael Muller here, I think the UN has also an effort to make, because what do we do, journalists? We defend the public good. But we're not alone. It's not a one-track job. We need to cooperate with the international organization, with the UN, and sometimes we don't see the sufficiently cooperation on the other side. And I would wish that it could happen. And I think that's basically my message. Yes. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Stéphane Bussard. And Mia Kirsch is our conclusions young discussant. Mia, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, and thank you everyone for being here tonight. I am part of the Junior Diplomat Initiative, and I'm honored to be presenting tonight some concluding thoughts for the youth participant in this panel and discussion. And the question I asked myself beforehand was, and during the dialogue as well, did the priorities of the younger generation have been truly mirrored in our discussions today? And from this outset, it is evident that this dialogue was structured with the future in mind, a future that the young will obviously inherit. The presence and active participation of young discussants across the panels, from Sarah Gügeli to Laura Siebenhaar and Natasha Bambou, underscores this commitment to integrating the voices of the next generation. The integration of voices in this panel was achieved further by giving some young participants from student initiatives the opportunity to evaluate the survey conducted beforehand and to present the results themselves. Nevertheless, the study shows that students and younger people feel that their impact and role in the multilateral system is limited. Furthermore, younger generations feel that older generations do not value their contributions in the UN system and in international Geneva. This points out that normative frameworks need to adapt. The dialogue showed further that the capacity of Geneva to adjust its historical strengths in normative work to address emerging challenges like digital governance, climate change, which are well aligned with the priorities of a generation living with the consequences of those challenges. However, given today's rigid and slow system, the promotion of more flexible frameworks would be desirable to adequately address the ideas and approaches of the younger generation. Thus, the emphasis on multidisciplinary strategies to address complex global crises already reflects a youthful push for innovative, holistic approaches rather than siloed actions. This resonates with their broader expectations for systematic change. The discussion on expanding stakeholder cooperation are in line with the younger generation's belief in more inclusive, transparent governance structures, suggesting that their views on participation and representation are being taken into account. It should not be forgotten that developing clear pathways for translating dialogue outcomes into policy should reduce the likely resistance that may be encountered in political, economic, and bureaucratic processes. These reflections confirm further that the priorities of the young generation have not only been recognized, but actively integrated in our dialogue today. However, as we take these discussions forward to the World Summit on the Future and the UN Civil Society Conference in Nairobi, it is vital that we continue to integrate these youth perspectives into the policies and actions, ensuring that our vision for the future is not only given a voice. As Madame Ajivere said before, let's stop the talking. Let's start listening and act upon it. Thank you.
Thank you. Alejandro, Mr. Greycells President, you opened this dialogue. I give you the floor for you. Closing remarks.
Well, thank you very much. It's late, and I wouldn't be the last obstacle for the cocktail and to the award ceremony that we had. I think we have heard everything, and in Geneva we are used to have nice, short meetings. This was long. But I think it really was very interesting. And in most meetings, I usually know what people is going to say. But in these intergenerational dialogues, we hear things that we did not expect to hear. Starting from the kitchen to the dining room and all the rest, I got lots of surprises and I learned a lot. I really will have to digest what has been said here. I would not like to give a wrong impression that we only care. Of course we care, and they were deeply involved about future generations of younger persons, of younger people. We are concerned about everybody. The last intergenerational dialogue that Greycells organized, title was "The Rights of Older People Are Human Rights." And we had then Anne Marais, who had an spectacular result in promoting the environment and bringing Switzerland to justice for its inaction. And then she's not young. She's very respectable, but she's not young. So, and also one last thing. I hate to discuss medicines without talking about the patient, about people. And I have a problem because I'm an actuary, which is half demographer and half financial people. And when I see the patient, the people in the world, we the people in the world, we're going to go through very dramatic transformations. The population from China will fall from 1.4 billion to 800 million. Considering the impact of the economy of China in the world, that's going to have an impact in productivity and in everything. And I could go on, Japan, the United States, Africa, Latin America, there are going to be dramatic transformations. And one of the most important transformations is the aging of population. 40% of the population by the end of the century will be older, what we consider old people, which are consumers. That will have to impact the private sector, and which are voters. I had a problem today going to Swisscom because I was shocked by, I almost had to go through artificial intelligence to put on my phone. So the older people were facing issues, and a woman that retires today will expect to live for 30 years with AI. So the problems are for everybody, and we'll have to adapt. Well, we are extremely grateful of the Swiss Club Suisse de la Presse for hosting us. We're extremely thankful of the Diplomatic Club of Geneva for supporting this activity. I thank all the panelists for their very important contributions, and I wouldn't like to end this without acknowledging Manuela Tortora, who was the lead of this whole intergenerational dialogue.
And we now open the very last chapter of the evening, nearly party time. This is now awards time, and I declare open the brief award ceremony of the youth contest, Greycells International Geneva Prize, in cooperation with the Geneva Diplomatic Club. So please join me on stage, Mr. Michael Muller, President of the Youth Contest Jury, Alejandro, of course, Greycells President, and Mrs. Eponyme Dapoigny. Thank you for joining us, Mrs. Dapoigny, representing the Geneva Diplomatic Club. So, Alejandro, please remain as why Greycells Youth Contest, and what were the rules?
Well, this is just a dream come true. This is something that we have been discussing in Greycells for many years, and one of our aims is building bridges and giving the opportunity to the younger generations to voice themselves, also to the older generations. But we have been thinking about this prize for a number of years, and we're not mistaken. You've heard, and we were very impressed by the contributions of the youth tonight, but we were really very impressed, and we wanted to hear and to read the importance and the message of the younger generations. I think the result went beyond our expectations, and we're really very happy. We hope which is the first prize that Greycells awards, will continue in the future and will grow in prestige. Thank you.
So, and Mrs. Dapoigny, just tell us in a few words why Geneva Diplomatic Club supports this contest.
Yes, thank you. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for welcoming me on behalf of the Diplomatic Club of Geneva for this intergenerational dialogue on the role of international Geneva in UN 2.0. Committed to promoting international dialogue, our club recognizes the crucial importance of innovation and education in strengthening intergenerational exchanges and international cooperation. Therefore, we have chosen to support the multimedia category of this competition with a prize of 1,000 francs. Multimedia, transcending borders and generation, is a powerful tool for propagating the ideas of the UN and shaping modern diplomacy. By rewarding efforts in this area, we hope to inspire young creators to contribute to a more connected and understanding world. Thank you for your commitment to this vital exchange.
Thank you for the support of Geneva Diplomatic Club. And now, Mr. Muller, you have now the floor to announce the winners, the two winners of the contest and the special prize of Greycells Youth Contest. Please.
Thank you very much. We've heard a lot, as was just said, about involvement and participation of youth in what we do, and hopefully it will increase. But for the purpose of today, it's very appropriate that we end by giving out prizes for youth involvement in what we're doing. So, as in all contests, of course, there are winners, and the jury examined all submissions very impartially, based on criteria that were established by the rules of this contest, and decided that the winner of the category multimedia is Miss Jade Worth. I understand that she's going to be
Jade, we can applaud her. And
hello, Jade.
Hello, Jade. Thank you for being with us tonight, and congratulations for being the winner of this Greycells Youth Contest with the multimedia category. So you're with us, we can hear you, so please, you have the floor.
Thank you so much. I'm truly honored. Winning this prize means a lot to me, and I really did not expect it, to be honest. I would like to thank the jury for choosing my video. Above all, I would like to thank Professor Benoît Girardin, who is a very knowledgeable Swiss former ambassador that I interviewed in my video, and without whom this would have not been possible. So thank you to him and to his participation. I mean, again, thank you. I'm very short. When I joined the contest, it was simply to participate. I did not have any intention of winning, to be honest. I chose to take part in this contest because I really like editing videos, because I genuinely also love and believe in the value of the UN and its work. I mean, I am currently myself interning in UNCTAD, so UN for Trade and Development in Geneva. So I do believe in the importance and the relevance of the UN, especially in Geneva, as the topic is about. So again, I was also very happy to put Geneva, the city of Geneva, in the spotlight, if I can say. I've been living in this very beautiful city for 3 years now, and I've grown to love it very dearly. So for me, it was kind of like a tribute to the city. So again, thank you. I apologize I cannot be here in person. I'm very disappointed about this, very wrong timing. But I'm very honored for this. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jade.
Thank you, Jade.
Thank you for getting inspired by Geneva and especially International Geneva. So, Mr. Muller, I give you back the floor to announce the first prize of the written text category.
Yes, and the winner of the category written text is Yanis Bonnet. Yanis, maybe you could tell us what you actually wrote. Okay. I think.
And please, you can have a look at the camera. So. everybody online can see.
Well, it was a bit unexpected. I don't know what to improvise. What I wanted to write. Actually, it was my feeling, and I think it's shared among young people, young students, the feelings of what is to be in Geneva, to study in Geneva, what we hope and what we expect from Genève internationale. I think Natasha told about this as well. It was very, very, I had the same feeling when you say that we are rich of this place, we are rich of all that it can bring, and actually we need to keep that, and we need to progress in this way of being efficient, being always in the dialogue, in cooperation among all the stakeholders and everything. And I think it's, at my level, I think it's the way of how the future UN should go, through more dialogue, through more cooperation, and through more understanding of each other, and especially among intergenerational dialogue, as we are here. So thank you very much, and of course, thank you for all the panelists. And
thank you, Yannis.
Thank you.
Okay. Please stay with us, so we'll then have a group picture. And so, well,
finally,
he'll come back. Michael, you have a special prize to announce.
Yes. Just to make the point that we are really talking about the youth, we decided that we were going to give a special award to the youngest participant. And I'm very pleased to name Ms. Kirsten Natalia Bolanos, who is 12 years old.
Oh.
Congratulations.
Thank you. Okay.
Can you tell us a little bit about what you wrote?
So I honestly don't know what to say. I wrote a short poem of my understanding of the role of International Geneva and its role in UN 2.0, which, to be honest, I still don't completely understand. But as a student, as a minor, I still understand that it's very important, and that this may be the solution to, well, everything in our world nowadays. And I'm really generally interested in the UN and the SDGs, so I'm very happy to be merely noticed in this competition. So thank you very much.
I don't think we could have a better statement to finish our meeting than what we just heard. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Kirsten.
Oh, please, Kirsten, maybe you just come back, and with also Yannis for a group picture, if you agree, before we close the evening. Yes, please. I'll just get in front of the tables. Yes, here. Yes. So we can place. It's picture time. No second opportunity. Another applause. Well, thank you so much. Thank you. It was a great idea of creating this youth contest awards, of course. We're now getting to the end of our evening. We're all very thirsty and very hungry, so I suggest we keep talking with a glass of wine or whatever in our hand with all our panelists. You will find online on Greycells websites in 1 or 2 days the texts and the video of the winners of the contest. Do you, Alejandro, want to add something else? I, again, thank you very much. I thank very much Greycells, all our really very interesting panelists. I thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, here at Geneva Press Club and online for your attention. And now I invite you to get downstairs, and just a few meters away, you'll find our cocktails, and we can keep chatting together. So thanks you for attention, and see you maybe again next year for 2025 Greycells International Dialogue. Thank you.